that is going to be dropped from 60 to 50. And this is really, really important because bowel cancer is one of the biggest killers, and more people appear to be getting diagnosed with bowel cancer in their 50s. Not entirely clear why. And there was an inspirational woman called Deborah James who I actually met when I used to be the Shadow Health Secretary, and I remember meeting her when she had her cancer diagnosis and supporting her campaign, and she sadly passed away a couple of years ago, but it was a phenomenal campaign, and I think did inspire the nation. And this is so important. So people in their 50s are going to be sent these kits in the post. And I suppose my plea is just do not ignore these kits because you can deal with cancer if you catch it early enough.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, this is not the most pleasant thing to do, and a lot of us aren't used to it and talking about it and whatever, but it's essential, obviously, to do.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And the other reason I wanted to sort of flag this is, I mean, we can sometimes make ourselves sort of pretty miserable looking at the newspapers, but this is undoubtedly a good initiative that the government have done this, and that campaigners have persuaded the government to do this. So, look, I just want to plea to everybody watching, if you get one of these kits, use it.
And, of course, I think it's really important within that to point out that this would not have helped Deborah, because Deborah was 40 when she died. And what's really important when you see stories like this is to pay attention to what your body is telling you. And if you have symptoms that are weird, it is important to go to your doctor and to talk about them and to take the tests.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 12 o'clock on Thursday, the 23rd of January. I'm Tom Harwood.
And I'm Emily Carver.
Now, breaking news this hour, of course, after apparently refusing to come to the dock, now Axel Rudakabana, the Southport killer, is there in the dock. But reports are he's uncooperative. We're live at Liverpool Crown Court.
And we are now joined by GB News Home and Security Editor Mark White to tell us more. Mark, you're in Liverpool for us. Please give us any updates that you have.
Well, very dramatic scenes, it appears, from inside the courtroom at Liverpool Crown Court, as, yes, Axel Radicabanu has agreed to go up to the dock, was sitting in the dock, but we're now hearing from our colleague inside the court that he is screaming in that dock, screaming that he is unwell, that he needs a paramedic. The defence apparently has said that he hasn't eaten for a number of days and he's hardly drunk anything, this according to his defence. So he's also apparently, according to Sophie Reaper, my colleague, saying that his chest is hurting. The judge has told the prosecution to continue, but Axel Rudakabana is continuing, it seems, to shout. So, as we feared, you know, he can be brought to the dock, but he can be very disruptive to the process, and it appears that is exactly what he's doing. Now, if this disruption continues at the level it seems to be at, with him screaming that he is unwell, then it may be that the judge has to decide that for the continuance of the sentencing process itself, that he is to be removed from the dock. No confirmation that that will happen. He may calm down of his own volition, but at the moment he is continuing, it seems, to be very disruptive in the dock itself. And some key information as the prosecution sets out the case that they would have put before Liverpool Crown Court had this gone to a full trial, had Axel Rudakabana not pleaded guilty as he did on Monday there, that case would have been presented to the jury. Now we're getting it in summary form, and the prosecutor setting out the case said that after his arrest, Axel Rudakabana would not speak to investigators, would not cooperate. He's not been cooperative at all throughout this process. But in the custody suite, he was caught on audio apparently muttering that he was satisfied, that he was glad that the girls had been killed and that he set out to achieve what he wanted to achieve. So absolutely horrific news, of course, for the families to have to listen to that. Just getting some more information from court. Right, we're now being told that he's been sent out, and Alice De Silva Aguia's father has called him a coward inside court. Understandable that he would feel that way towards this man who carried out these horrific stabbings, killing his 9-year-old daughter Alice. Alice's father shouting towards Axel Rudakabana that he is a coward as he's taken away from the dock, and the proceedings now are continuing without him. They will continue, of course, now much more smoothly, and the prosecution will be able to summarise the case that they would have put in full towards a full trial.
An apt word. What an apt word from the father of one of those murdered girls, that this is a coward that was in the dock, screaming that he needs medical attention, that he needs a paramedic, clearly trying to avoid listening to the horrors that he wrought on the people of Southport. What a snivelling little wretch. I mean, it is hard to imagine what those families are going through right now in court, seeing the attention-seeking, cowardly and inhuman behaviour that this creature is performing.
Yeah, I mean, of course, this was never going to be easy for the families of the 3 young girls who were murdered by this man and the others who were stabbed, including, of course, those 2 adults. It was never going to be an easy process. It was always going to be horrifying and traumatic. But to see this man acting out in the way that he has been inside the dock, you can only... well, you can't even begin to imagine just how that makes the family feel. And clearly the father of Alice De Silva Aguia deciding that, you know, she has to shout out and shout to this man as he's been taken away from the dock back down to the cells that he is a coward. He clearly was intent in not engaging, as he has done throughout this case, refused to engage with that legal process, not speaking initially to investigators, not even confirming the most basic of facts in his various court appearances of his name, his address, his date of birth, sitting in the dock with usually a jumper obscuring his face, pulled up over his face, and just not engaging with that process. That's why it was such a surprise, of course, on Monday when he said that he was going to plead guilty, and of course then did plead guilty to the 16 counts that he is facing. But I think it's worth, Tom, just reiterating what we have heard this morning, what we can tell you about what has happened here. He was brought, Axel Rudakabana, to court at about 10:30 this morning. He had been admitted to hospital in the early hours of this morning, had been held in a local prison in the area, awaiting what was expected, of course, to be this 8-week trial, now just a sentencing process. Taken to hospital for what we're told is treatment for unspecified reasons. The detail of that has not been revealed at this stage, although we did get a little from the Defence Counsel about issues that he says his client has faced, the fact that he's not been eating for a number of days, that he's not been drinking. He was apparently in the dock, eventually persuaded to come up to the dock after initially refusing to go up to the dock, and that resulted in an almost half-hour delay in the proceedings. He was shouting in the dock that he was unwell, that he had chest pains, that he needed a paramedic, and eventually continuing to be so disruptive and interrupting the prosecutor as he summarised the case against him, that the judge decided that it was in the best interest of the smooth running of justice for this man to be taken back down into the cells and for the hearing, the sentencing hearing, to continue without him.
So the sentence hearing will continue without him, as you say. Is there any chance that they might force him back up or try to force him back up for the actual sentencing when that comes?
I've just got another piece, an updated piece of breaking news. This is coming from Merseyside Police, who are disputing the reports of Axel Rudakabana being taken to hospital. Now, we're reporting what the Press Association had reported. This was a line that the Press Association had put out about him receiving treatment in hospital. Now Merseyside Police have said, so worth us imparting this. We've seen reporting that Axel Rudakabana attended hospital for treatment this morning. This, they say, is incorrect. So that is correction to the record. Clearly, he was not taken to hospital. Whatever issues he might have had medically, according to the police, he was not taken to hospital. It's possible that he was seen by a doctor or treated within the prison environment. We don't know the details of that, but clearly we did hear from the defence barrister in court there issues about his health because the likes of the fact that he's not been eating or drinking, and indeed himself in the court. The first time really that we've heard from this man since he carried out these horrific murders, that he was not feeling well, that he was suffering chest pains.
This is, of course, highly distressing for people to hear. But it does give an insight, I suppose, into the mind of this man. What do you think he's trying to achieve here? Not eating for days, delaying his appearance in court, and then screaming and shouting. As well, Mark, as that comment that you said that was made to police a little earlier, where he said, "I'm glad they're dead," talking about those girls. I mean, is he trying to put on a show? Is this normal for murderers in the many court appearances that you've attended?
Sometimes, sadly, it is the case that those who are in the dock can be disruptive. I have to say, in the vast majority of cases, offenders convicted or appearing, of course, in court before being convicted tend to behave themselves because clearly they want to receive a not guilty verdict. So being disruptive in court is going to count against them, of course, in the eyes of a jury. But all bets are off, sadly, when it comes to sentencing, because verdicts have been passed by that time. And if people, particularly those convicted of very horrific offences, who want to gain notoriety and publicity for those crimes, they often see this as their day in court, their opportunity to get their, whatever their twisted logic and view is, across to the wider world. And I've seen it before. I spoke a little earlier about the case of the murderers of soldier Lee Rigby, the trial that took place at the Old Bailey there of Michael Adebawale and Michael Adebalajo, and those men were disruptive during the trial, but in particular at the sentencing hearing, shouting and interrupting the judge to the point where, after passing sentence, they were taken down to the cells, but fighting all the way with police officers from the dock down into the cells below the dock itself. And that was extremely traumatic, of course, for the family of Lee Rigby in court, for others in court that had to watch this spectacle. So The court will do its level best to try to avoid that kind of disruption, and it has been very traumatic already for the families. I'm just hearing from our colleague Sophie Reaper inside court that some of the parents are in tears hearing details about what happened to those young children at the Heart Space building in Southport on the 29th of July last year. Alice de Silva Aguiar's father is, we're told, had his head in his hands hearing about his daughter being stabbed. You can only imagine how difficult it's been for them to process. There, of course, will be facts that they'll have been privy to from family liaison officers throughout this process, but hearing it set out in terms in a court of law has got to be distressing for any family member. And then hearing that on top of seeing this man who has had utter contempt for the legal process, who continued to show that contempt in the dock to the point where he had to be removed from the dock just minutes ago, only compounds, I think, the trauma and the grief that those families are suffering, because, as I say, our colleague telling us that some of those family members, not just, of course, of the 3 girls who were murdered, but members of the other families of the other girls who were stabbed and seriously injured by Axel Rudakabana as well.
It's hard to imagine going through anything more traumatic than being the parents of those poor girls that sadly lost their lives and having to relive those moments. Mark, can you explain to our viewers and listeners what exactly is going to be happening today? I understand we're currently hearing from the prosecution. What then happens next?
So what it is effectively from the prosecution at the moment is a summary of the case. They would have put a very full case over 8 weeks to the jury here at Liverpool Crown Court. There is no jury, no need for a jury now, no case because he has pleaded guilty. But that summary of the case is now being read out by the prosecutor, that we expect to last an hour or two, giving those details, the facts of when he turned up just before midday on the 29th of July, what he did inside the Heart Space Centre in Hart Street in Southport in terms of carrying out that horrific attack. Sadly, the injuries that were suffered by those young girls and the 2 adults as well, who valiantly tried their level best to protect the young girls, but were stabbed, of course, in the process of doing that. There'll be background about Axel Rudakabana, his offending behaviour that was known about from as far back as 2019, when he was just 13 years of age, when he took a knife to school and in fact admitted taking knives to school on 10 separate occasions, threatening pupils, speaking very openly about his desire to carry out a school massacre or to go after an assault and stab people he claimed had been bullying him. He was referred to the Prevent Counter-Extremism programme not once but 3 times. The first time back in 2019 and then subsequently in 2014 again on another 2 occasions. But this counter-extremism programme, set up of course to deal with terrorist ideology, decided that he didn't fit into their idea of what a terrorist should look like, because it seems he was, if not aligning to, was certainly researching and fascinated by multiple terrorist ideologies. So he was not dealt with by Prevent. He was passed on to other agencies, the police, the courts, the youth justice system, social services, the health service, but all of these agencies refused or just didn't intervene in any meaningful way to steer this man, if it was even possible, away from the inevitable downward spiral into the violent attack that took place in Southport on the 29th of July last year, and of course that is something that the subsequent public inquiry in the months ahead will delve into in much more detail about the failings of state agencies to try to prevent what we saw that unfolded in Southport last year. So we are getting the prosecution summarising that case, the background of this individual, the missed opportunities, and then we will get victim impact statements. Now that's going to be incredibly difficult for, of course, the families to have to listen to. You know, it's their dearest thoughts about those who they loved and cherished, who were so cruelly snatched away from them on that day. We'll try our best to impart that to you, but it will, of course, be difficult. There will be, I'm sure, very emotional words that will be spoken on behalf of the families by lawyers in court. And after those victim impact statements have been read out, we will get the judge. Now, what we don't know is what's going to happen, given the delays as well, lunch breaks and things like that. So we don't have an exact timing for you, but then the judge will begin his sentencing remarks. Now, the judge often just summarises the case as well, but given that the prosecutor has just done that an hour or so beforehand, it may be that he doesn't have to go into full detail of summarising the case again, and he can get into the issues around what his sentencing will be, and he will take into, of course, account the likes of the aggravating factors around this, the fact that this was a violent individual who had clearly had violent episodes in the past, that he clearly planned this, that he had targeted in particular the Heart Space event, Taylor Swift themed dance class that was taking place with 25 children inside that event itself. Aggravating factors like this, of course, the horrific nature of the attack on all of the victims, the 3 who were murdered and the 10 others who were injured, who were stabbed by this man, as well as the other children who were traumatised, will have to live with this for the rest of their lives. So there will be mitigation put forward by his defence. There may be issues that the defence tries to put forward about his mental state. We don't know as yet. We'll have to listen to what that mitigation is. The judge will take that on board as well. And as well as the fact that, of course, that he pleaded guilty. He pleaded guilty at the last possible opportunity, which was just before the trial. But that still, and that will be so disturbing for many people to actually contemplate, but because of the way in which the legal system operates, if you plead guilty before a trial takes place, then there is a discount to your sentence that the judge will have to, as a matter of law, take into account as well. Having said that, because there are so many aggravating factors, I think that discount is likely to count for very little at the end of the day. The big vex question, of course, is whether this young man will spend the rest of his life behind bars. And because he was 17 at the time that he committed those murders and other stabbings, he cannot be given what is called a whole life tariff. In other words, an absolute guarantee that he will spend the rest of his life behind bars. So it will be up to the judge to set what is called a minimum tariff, the time that he must spend behind bars before he is even considered eligible for release. And that's likely to be many decades, but we just don't know as yet what the judge will decide. And I'm sure much commentary on what the judge's eventual sentence decision is, but that's probably still a good 2 or 3 hours away.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for that. Of course, you're at the court for us throughout this afternoon, and we'll be back with you as we learn further updates. I should just say we have, of course, been hearing from the prosecutor, that's Deanna Here KC, and she has been saying in her opening remarks, summarising the prosecution's case, that this was a premeditated, planned knife attack upon multiple victims, principally young girls, intending to kill them. She added these 3 children were killed, 2 of whom suffered particularly horrific injuries, which are difficult to explain as anything other than sadistic in nature. And the defendant attempted to kill 10 others, inflicting a number of stab wounds upon them, including their backs, as they tried to escape. She went on to say that on his computer devices, a large number of images and documents were found which demonstrated he had a long-standing obsession with violence, killing and genocide. Added to that, among these documents, of course, the Al-Qaeda training manual, which contains instructions on how to produce the poisons, including ricin, and commit various acts of terror. She's been saying a lot about this case, and we'll bring you more from inside the courtroom. But let's get an overview now with the crime justice and policing commentator, Danny Shaw. Danny, this is, of course, a horrific case. But first, I want to ask you about the conduct of Axel Ruda-Cabana. He's been taken outside of the courtroom now, we understand, in a side room. Is it likely he'll be brought back in to hear that final sentence?
Well, I was monitoring the proceedings on a remote link and was watching as this was going on. And it is unusual in a sentencing hearing for a defendant to make such a fuss and shouting and screaming like that. I mean, it does happen during trials. You get sometimes defendants in the dock shouting out and so on, and sometimes they have to be removed from the courtroom if they don't stop shouting. The judge did give him quite a lot of opportunity either to quieten down or to try and continue the proceedings, hoping that he would just stop shouting. But eventually, the judge had to remove him from the courtroom to allow the proceedings to continue. And it's very evident that he hasn't spoken during the proceedings, apart from entering those guilty pleas. But suddenly, when it comes to a hearing at which all the details are going to be laid out about this most appalling massacre that he carried out, that he tries to disrupt the proceedings. He was trying to exert control, it seemed to me, over the proceedings. The judge actually said, I'm in control of these proceedings. They're going to continue, and you're going to have to leave the courtroom. I think he will make an effort, the judge. He will give him every opportunity to try to come back into court. I think there's going to be a break in about half an hour or so at 1 o'clock. The proceedings will resume presumably at 2. And there will be an opportunity for him then to come back into court. I would have thought another possibility is to ensure that he watches the proceedings on a video link. I don't know whether that's technically possible at Liverpool Crown Court, but I would have thought that might be an option. It's very, very important, in terms of the importance of the criminal justice system, that the defendant is there during the sentencing and is there when he or she is sentenced. It's a really important moment. But clearly, there comes a point when they're so disruptive that they have to be removed.
Yeah, and it appears as though, from what we've heard, that he's showing absolutely no remorse. In fact, when he was in the custody suite, he said, I'm glad those girls are dead, which is horrifying to hear. Previously, we have talked about how, whether he would get an audio link or something from the room that he's in, or, as you say, an audio visual, perhaps. But a lot of people getting in touch wondering why more can't be done to make sure that he does remain in the court, in the dock. Has there ever been... People are saying things like, could he be gagged? Could he be restrained in one way or another, just so that he has to sit through what he's done and sit through the victim impact assessments, because the victims' families will want him to know what he's done to them?
I understand the sentiment behind that. The reality is that you can't restrain someone to the point that you gag them in the dock. There could be potentially health concerns, and then it will be disruptive and it becomes a spectacle. And that's really not what it's designed for. I mean, I think the answer is to ensure that he has access to a video and audio feed, and so he can hear those statements. That is really I would have thought the best possible solution if he's still sort of shouting out and screaming out as he was.
I mean, it's all just so horrific. The act itself, the aftermath, the behaviour of this individual. Can we talk a little bit about what we might expect the judge to say in his sentencing remarks? Obviously, given the fact that this, well, I was about to say this man, this monster, whatever we want to call him, is under the age of 21, he can't be given a whole life tariff. Can you just explain what the difference is between a life sentence, a whole life tariff, and what the options the judge has before him are?
Yes, you know, the penalty for someone convicted of murder, whether they plead guilty or whether they're found guilty of murder, is a life sentence. For people who were under 18 at the time of the offence, and he was 9 days short of his 18th birthday when he committed the crimes, it's called something else. It's not actually called a life sentence. It's called detention at His Majesty's pleasure, but in effect, it means a life sentence. And the judge has to set a minimum period that person will serve in prison, because life sentence means that you're effectively, the maximum is your entire life, but there's a minimum period to be served in prison, and then the parole board decides when you're released. And that is the exercise that this judge will have to make, because he was under 18, it's not possible for him to be given a whole life order, which would mean that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. That's just the law as it stands at the moment. But the starting point at which the judge will consider how many years he should spend in prison is 27 years. And then there are certain factors he will take into account, which will probably raise that number. Because it was premeditated, it was planned, there were multiple victims, the victims were vulnerable, they were children, and so on. He's shown no remorse, etc. I imagine he will raise that number, 27, by a considerable amount. He might give him a little bit of credit for pleading guilty. That might just knock a year off it, won't make much difference. So he will arrive at a number, I would have thought, around the 40-year mark, but that will be the minimum period which he will serve in prison. Then the parole board at that point, when he'll be in his 50s or 60s by then, or even older, I get my maths right, will decide whether he's safe to be released. This is clearly a very, very dangerous young man. It's evident from what he's done, the appalling crimes that he's carried out, which we're now only learning the sort of full horror of, that he's extremely dangerous. Whether or not he is mentally ill, well, we wait to hear if there's evidence of that. It's not been suggested that there is any evidence that he's mentally ill, but he's clearly very, very disturbed to carry out such a crime like that and show no remorse whatsoever. Suggests someone to me who has some really very, very serious problems.
It's very hard to see sort of what side of the line it falls on. I mean, ultimately, can't you argue that anyone who thinks it's OK to kill is mentally ill? But then the term loses all meaning. Danny Shaw, thanks so much for joining us and for your expertise. We really, really appreciate it. We're going to head back to the court now, where our Home and Security editor, Mark White, has an update for us.
Well, what we are hearing now in court and seeing is some CCTV illustrations of the journey that Axel Rudakabana took to court, took to the Heart Space, I should say, centre in Southport on the 29th of July last year to carry out this attack. We've seen CCTV from inside, actually, the taxi itself, a security camera in that taxi cab as he's asking where the Heart Space Centre is. He's sitting in the back seat. His face, or at least part of his face, is visible. He's wearing a surgical mask over the lower half of his face. And then after the taxi driver pulls up, the taxi driver's asking him if he's going to pay by cash or card. At that moment, Axel Rudakabana has no intention, clearly, of paying. It's the last thing on his mind. This is a man clearly with murder on his mind, who left that taxi, heads to the front door of the Heart Space building, and at that point makes his way into the building. And what's happening now at the moment is that we are getting information in the form of the evidence that's going before the court now about the situation that faced those children inside the centre itself. Is very graphic evidence they're going through about the stabbing of course, the victims. I should just say there's a disturbance that's taking place outside court at the moment. There's protesters shouting and some rounds of applause for that protester, but we'll just continue giving the evidence here at the moment. Some of the families are understandably in tears, very distressed at what they are hearing coming out of court at the moment. Some have actually taken the decision to leave the court, that they don't want to listen to the very graphic nature of the evidence, and it is incredibly graphic, and we've taken the decision here on GB News not to go into a great deal of detail about exactly what this man did inside that building and what he did to those young girls and the two adults. Suffice to say, it was an absolutely horrific event that unfolded, that of course we know resulted in the murders of those three young girls, aged just 6, 7 and 9, as well as the stabbing of 8 other girls and the 2 adults. So that is being set out now, as I say, by the prosecutor. Some of the families who stayed in, very distressed, understandably, at what they're hearing from inside the Liverpool Crown Court.
I can imagine. Mark, victim impact assessments, I imagine they'll be incredibly moving to hear and distressing too. Do we know at this stage who might give an impact assessment? Will that be the parents of some of the victims, perhaps?
Well, we don't know that exactly, whether a relative will stand up and speak. That sometimes happens, and that can be very powerful, of course, when you're hearing from a family member themselves about how they have been impacted by the death of a loved one. It may be that those family members, quite understandably, just do not feel up to standing there and reading out the impact statement themselves. So what can then often happen is that the impact statements are read out by a representative in court, legal counsel or someone else in court. So we await to see whether family members themselves, in some of the cases, might stand up and read some of those impact statements out. But whatever, whether it either comes from a legal team or indeed a family member, they will be very powerful, they will be very moving, and of course very distressing as well, there's no doubt.
It's incredibly moving to hear this, to see what's going on, to get a real feeling for what's going on inside that courtroom. One element that caught my eye from Deanna here, KC, the prosecutor, is that immediately before getting that taxi, Axel Rudakabana searched online for the Sydney stabbing, the terrorist attack that stabbed Bishop Emmanuel, 5 others in Sydney back in April. I remember reporting on it at the time. That was declared to be a terror incident. A teenager was arrested following that stabbing. It seems that there is this obsession from this man with terror, genocide, teenagers stabbing, but also perhaps inter-ethnic, inter-religious conflicts too.
Yes, there's no doubt he had a sickening interest in violence and death, and he seemed to research that on multiple fronts, and perhaps that goes to some way to explaining at least Prevent's argument that they were unable to, it seems, in examining the background of this individual when he was referred to them as far back as 2019, when he was just 13 years of age. They did not find, they said, that he was aligned to any particular ideology, rather that he was accessing lots of different material, from genocides to terrorist literature, from both the far left, jihadists, the far right, all of the above. Was what was being consumed by this young man with a very twisted and violent outlook on life that, of course, perhaps in some way exacerbated that the sort of move towards being increasingly violent. Whatever was going on in his head, he did that. The police in their investigations have been able to ascertain that he was looking at multiple sources to get his fix for the kind of horrific violence that he then, of course, enacted himself on the 29th of July last year. I should say, just in the last few minutes, my colleague Sophie Reaper reporting from the courts that the court has now been shown an image of the murder weapon, a 20-centimetre kitchen knife, a chef's knife, that Axel Rudakabana had purchased on Amazon online. He had got round some of the safety protocols on Amazon that ensures, of course, or is meant to ensure, that knives are not sent to people who are under the age of 18. Software apparently that he used that got round those particular safety protocols. Regardless, of course, it was a kitchen knife. He could have got a kitchen knife from his own drawer. The outcome would have been pretty much the same, which was absolute carnage within that dance class in Southport. But that, as I say, has now been shown to the members of the sort of those attending this courtroom hearing, no jury to be presented with this information now at this point. Just those family members gathered, the legal counsel, the judge, and of course many members of the press who are inside this courtroom, as well as they continue to listen to the case in summary form being set out by the barrister for the Crown Prosecution Service.
The man who was referred to Prevent a number of times, the counter-terrorism scheme that we have, he also completed rehabilitation activities aimed at young offenders. He also was in contact with social care services as well. Clearly his parents knew that he was very disturbed too, spending all of his time in his bedroom, never leaving it. He exhibited anger back in year 9, was expelled from a school, came back with a hockey stick. Again, so many opportunities missed to stop what happened in July. It's just shocking to read that despite him exhibiting so many of these disgusting behaviours and deeply concerning behaviours, that somehow there wasn't a way to, keep him under check, to keep him under surveillance, to make sure that he wasn't able to just go about freely and plot such a devastating attack.
You're right, it's a complete scandal. It appears to be state agency failings on an industrial scale. This was a man who was referred to multiple agencies over a number of years. Clearly they knew, because he was quite open about his feelings and what he wanted to do, that this was a very dangerous individual. The fact he'd taken, by his own admission, a knife or knives into school on 10 separate occasions, the fact that he'd assaulted and broken the wrist of a fellow pupil with a hockey stick just a couple of months after being excluded. The fact that, you know, he was clearly researching and fascinated by all of this extremist material must surely have set alarm bells ringing amongst those state agencies that were reviewing this young man, his mental state, his potential risk to the public, having had this young man referred to them. But agency after agency has failed, and that's why, quite separate from the criminal case that we are now discussing with regard to the evidence that's going before the court, we will have that public inquiry announced very swiftly by the government to answer these very searching questions that need to be answered about how on earth these various agencies could have failed in such a spectacular way that didn't intervene. And of course now we see the subsequent consequences of the lack of any meaningful intervention with regard to Axel Rudikabana.
You'd think with those, was it two, Mark, you said, 2 occasions that he brought a knife into school and was found to have done so?
10.
10. He was found to have brought a knife into school 10 times. And those were only the times he was discovered.
Tom, he admitted that he took knives into school on 10 separate occasions. It may have been more. He was found with a knife, which led to his exclusion, only to return, of course, a couple of months later and to attack a fellow pupil and break his wrist with a hockey stick. He was clearly a violent individual. This was his own admission that he had carried knives into school on 10 separate occasions, that he admitted he wanted to stab those that he had claimed were bullying him and were involved in what he described as racist bullying. So all of this
racist,
was not facts that had to be discovered by the agencies. This is Axel Rudikabana apparently being very open about his desire to to inflict harm, in fact, to carry out a school massacre. He had said as much. The dangers were obvious. That's why this is such a horrific scandal involving multiple agencies that will, in the fullness of time, in this public inquiry, I'm sure shock you and I and everyone else listening even more profoundly than just the initial details that we're able to sort of impart at this time, when actually we find out exactly what those different agencies and those caseworkers were being told, did find out, and why they decided to pass the buck effectively onto another agency who did just the same to the next agency, until effectively there was no action of any sort that was in any way meaningful to try to redress the way in which this young man was deteriorating and heading down a road to violent extremism.
It's in any way to be a mitigation, but I understand that after he was expelled from the school that he'd brought a knife into on many occasions and then went back with a hockey stick, I understand he was diagnosed with some kind of autism, something on the spectrum, and then there was a failure to reintegrate him into the education system at all. And then you had that combined with the pandemic and the shutdown of schooling as well, which may well have complicated matters further. It's a very complex story, this killer.
It is a very complex story, and you're right. It seems that he has been diagnosed as someone who was on the spectrum in terms of autism, but, you know, there are degrees which people suffer from autism, and there are many, many people right across the country who, to a greater or lesser degree, are on the spectrum and don't enact whatever their issues are in a violent way. There's nothing to suggest, apparently, in what we've been hearing, and it will be set out, I'm sure, in more detail in the coming hours in the court, and may well actually come out in mitigation from his own team. But there's nothing that it seems that the prosecutors and indeed the court and the trial judge felt was any impairment to this young man standing trial accused of murder. They were not claiming that he was somehow incapacitated by mental disorder to the point where he didn't realise what he was doing and the consequences of his action. And that is the litmus test here in terms of whether someone actually has a very significant and serious mental disorder, is whether they actually realise just how wrong the crime they're committing is, and whether they actually realise the full consequences of their action. It's clear that prosecutors, the trial judge, felt that he did, and that it was safe to put this man on trial. And I have to say as well that I hear, and I know that our audience and so many people around the country get absolutely exasperated when they hear what they claim to be the mental health card used so often. And that is true. I think it's often become almost a default position for many defence lawyers to look in to issues around the mental state and well-being of a defendant, to put that forward as mitigation. The fact is, anyone that's going to carry out an act like this, a horrific act like this, I would say is not necessarily someone who is the sanest of individuals. There has to be some clear issues in terms of someone's mental condition to go off and do that. Normal people don't do that, but that doesn't mean that they don't know that there are consequences to their actions, that they don't know that what they're doing is bad, is horrific, it is wrong. And that is the test, as I say, with regard to actually using mental disorder as real mitigation in a crime, as to, you know, my client not being aware of what he was doing because of the very deep psychosis that that client may have been suffering. There's no indication that that is the case in this particular instance.
Right, so if there's a persistent state of mind, i.e. as we've seen with Axel Rudakabana, that he isn't sort of in and out of moments of mania, he is always like this. This is just who he is. He is an individual obsessed with killing, genocide, violence, stabbing, terrorism, all of these things. This is just the fundamental makeup. It's in his genes.
Well, I don't know if it's in his genes or not, and let's just see what the defence argue is the case with regard to his mental state. But at the end of the day, if you're going to put forward a defence to say that your client is mentally disturbed, it has to be to the level that, you know, their mind is altered to the point that they are not aware of the actions, the consequences of their actions. They're not even aware that they're doing it. They can't remember that they're doing it. There's no suggestion, from what I've seen and the information that has been put forward already by the authorities, to suggest that there was any incapacitation or any degree of mental concern around this individual, that he wouldn't have been fully aware of just how wrong the criminality that he was engaged in indulging in.
Now, Mark, just to recap, Axel Rudakabana initially refused to go up to the dock in the court there at Liverpool Crown Court, refused to. He then did go up to the dock and behaved extremely badly, very uncooperative, shouting and screaming and refusing, saying that he needed a doctor and all of this and that. So the judge sent him out, but there is a hope still that he may return for the actual sentencing.
Well, listen, it's certainly possible, but I think given his behaviour, given the fact that he just shouted constantly during the attempts of the prosecutor to outline the case against him, I'm not convinced that he will be actually brought up to the court. I think Danny Shaw was saying perhaps they may get him a fee. It is, of course, in the interest of justice, important for someone who is about to lose their liberty for many, many years to be able to hear the reasoning for that and to, hear the case that's been put against him. That is important. So it's possible he may get some kind of either live audio feed or a feed afterwards. So the full decision-making process is explained to him, but actually bring him back into court to put the families through what was clearly very, very distressing and disturbing for them. The fact that the father of Alice da Silva Aguirre shouted out as he was taken down back from the dock, back down into the cells, that he is a coward, shows you just how very impacted and traumatised the families were by seeing the way that he was acting in the dock, shouting that he was ill, that he needed medical attention, that he had chest pains. As I say, the defence for Axel Rudakabana apparently told the judge as well that he hadn't been eating for a number of days, hadn't been drinking as well, which may have exacerbated the condition that he was in. We had earlier reported that he was actually taken to hospital. That had come from the Press Association news agency through their sources. Merseyside Police have since corrected that to say those reports are not correct. Now, that doesn't mean that there wasn't some kind of medical intervention. Perhaps it took place at the prison, maybe even at the court this morning. But as far as him being sent to the hospital, Merseyside Police confirming to us and other news outlets who've been running that line that that is not true, that he did not go to hospital, whatever ailments he said he was suffering.
Now, of course, we're expecting a break during these court proceedings. We're expecting that to come at 1 o'clock, Mark. Do stay with us. Do stay there outside the court, because we will be with you and indeed with Sophie Reaper, our reporter in the room. We'll be speaking to both of you in the next few minutes. So do stay with us, Mark, and we will be back to you. But Emily, my goodness me, this has been an hour of live programming I will find it hard to forget. The details are shocking, and frankly, the news from inside the courtroom too. Yeah, the lack of remorse. Just thinking about the parents of the victims, the families. I mean, it must be totally hard to bear. But but I imagine many of them feel like they have to be there, and they need to see this man go down, this monster go down. Lots of you getting in touch that this makes you think of bringing back capital punishment, and I think a lot of people will be feeling that very same, just hoping that he'll get the toughest sentence that he can get. Wondering also too what type of prison he'll be sent to. Yes. Of course, he is an adult now. 17 when he committed this crime, but only a few days off. 9 days. Only a few days off being an adult. Isn't it extraordinary that 9 days makes all the difference between being able to have a whole life tariff or otherwise being... I don't know if it will affect the type of prisoner in. These are the questions that we'll be asking, of course, in the next hour. So angry that it could have been stopped. Yeah. Could have been prevented. So many opportunities. So many different services, so many different public agencies. I'm sorry, the parents too. We're hearing also that, it was one of the parents that signed off for the package that had the knife. Yes, he could have used any number of weapons, to commit this type of crime, but so many failures across the board. Just terrible. And I think that there will be so many questions to be asked of those social services, of the police, of the Prevent programme. At every single step along the way, there were clearly good people who pointed out that this is a deeply disturbed individual. Yeah. Dare I say it's an unreformable individual who has time and time again been given opportunities to step back from the path he's on and has refused to do so. We don't have enough... Maybe we don't, have a place for someone like this until they commit such a crime as this. Well, this is what prison should be for, should it not be? I mean, should we not be imprisoning people before they commit heinous acts? Well, if we saw, one way or another, yeah. I mean, if he was discovered with a knife on any occasion... Why is that not a custodial sentence? Why don't we imprison anyone anyone
have some
who is
kind of
discovered
rehabilitation.
at a school with a knife.
He had some kind of rehabilitation as a teenager. I don't know how long it went on for, but clearly it did nothing to rehabilitate him.
No.
So, but then, you know, some people think there's just evil in this world.
Well, I think it is possible that there are some people who are reformable, but I think we are seeing a case here, and there are cases like it. Some people are not reformable. I think that's a political decision that we have to arrive at some point.
OK, well, this is Good Afternoon Britain on GB News. We'll be back with Mark White and Sophie Reaper from Inside the Court next.
There's just 2 weeks left to grab your chance to win our biggest cash prize so far. £50,000 in tax-free cash. How would you react if you won?
Oh my God.
That's a big surprise.
Amazing. Just the best feeling ever.
I'm in shock. That is absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
For another chance to win, text cash to 63232. One entry costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. Or text bonus to 63232. 5 entries cost £5 plus one standard network rate message. Go to gbnews.com/win. Entries start from just £2. You can call 0903 681 3232. Calls cost £2 plus your network access charge. Or post your name and number to GB10 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 6 p.m. on the 31st of January. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
GB News Breakfast. Every day from 6 a.m.
Have you noticed that more and more stores are closing? Well, last year, apparently 13,000 stores closed for the last time on the high street.
Well, experts warn the worst is still to come for our small businesses.
Well, let's talk to retail expert Jeremy Baker. Good morning to you, Jeremy. How bad is it and what can be done?
Well, nothing can be done about it. Retail is like that. It's boom and bust operation. So last year, let's say you had a shop and it was booming. This year, the consumer can just change their mind. They don't need to come back to your shop ever again.
Well, it is sad, Jeremy, because our high streets are the beating heart of our communities, aren't they? And for many people, I know I can relate to my high street, it is such a depressing sight, walking down there and seeing them all boarded up and closed down.
But how often do you walk down there and boarded up high street? I think people move on to something else. The online world is very big. Yeah. And lots of other things are very exciting. And so people, you know, the shop, I like to go to my GP in a shopping centre and get my tests done there rather than tramp off all the way to the GP, for example. And children could go to little schools in the high street. I've seen that happen already. So lots of things could happen to the high street. It could be much more social centre. Much more kind of like pubs, coffee shops, all that. Charities. I don't see anything wrong with charities taking over. But the idea of this shop-centred high street, finished, that's gone. Never coming back. Goodbye. It's not sad, it's just life.
GB News, the People's Channel.
OK, good afternoon, Britain. It's 1 o'clock on Thursday, the 23rd of January. I'm Emily Carver.
And I'm Tom Harwood.
Well, dramatic scenes inside the Liverpool Crown Court as Southport killer Axel Ruda is removed from his sentence hearing.
Well, victims' families calling him a coward at the court as pivotal moments are played of the Southport tragedy.
Yes, well, Mark White is there and has the latest for us.
Well, Axel Ruda has now been taken back down to the cells because of the disruption inside the court. Absolutely terrible and traumatic scenes for the families who were understandably distressed by this. We'll have much more for you soon.
Well, it's not a normal show today.
Nope.
It's not a normal court hearing. It's not a normal sentencing. But we're here following all of the events at the sentencing of Axel Rudikabana.
Yes, so do stick with us. We've got Sophie Reaper inside Liverpool Crown Court. We've got Mark White outside of Liverpool Crown Court. You won't miss a thing here on GB News. But let's get the bulletins now with Tatiana Sanchez.
Emily, thank you very much. We start with that breaking news story that the judge at the sentencing hearing for child killer Axel Rudikabana has ordered him to be removed from the court as he shouted repeatedly, saying to the judge, "I need to see a paramedic because I feel ill," a warning some of the following details viewers may find distressing. The sentencing hearing was initially slightly delayed as GB News understands he'd refused to enter the court. When he did eventually re-enter, he was heard saying, "I'm glad they're dead." Alice De Silva Aguirre, BB King and Elsie Stankham were all murdered in the vicious knife attack last July. The court was shown a picture of the murder weapon, a 20-centimetre kitchen knife. BB and Elsie died at the scene. Alice was rushed to hospital where, quote, her heart stopped beating. Prosecutors have said the injuries they suffered are difficult to explain as anything other than sadistic in nature. The court heard that many were inflicted to the back of the victims, suggesting they were inflicted as the victims were trying to escape. Rudikabana also was sentenced for producing a biological toxin and being in possession of a PDF named the Al-Qaeda Training Manual. Victims' families called him a coward inside the court. It's emerged he was known to authorities, but they all failed to intervene. Downing Street earlier indicated nothing is off the table to protect children when asked what actions would be taken to enforce the Keir Starmer's promise of tougher rules on online knife sales. Elsewhere, the Metropolitan Police has been removed from special measures after more than 2 years as good progress has been made, according to the watchdog. The force had been put into special measures following extensive criticism it faced after the death of Sarah Everard, who was abducted and murdered by serving Met police officer Wayne Cousins. His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services said the Met has made a number of improvements, including in how quickly calls are answered in professional standards and in investigating missing children. Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley said the whole force has worked to fix its broken foundations.
Sadly, the Met's foundations were badly damaged. There were lots of the underpinnings of the Met that needed repair work, and they've all pulled together to do that. And we've made improvements across call handling. We're in our call handling centre here, where we're dealing with over 4.5 million contacts from the public a year. We've made improvements in how we identify child exploitation, made improvements in solving rape and serious sexual offences. We've put many more officers in that area. We've strengthened our commitment to neighbourhood policing. We've got 500 more officers there. So across the Met, we've been stacking up our attention to the detail.
Sir Keir Starmer is vowing to take on the NIMBYs by reducing legal challenges to infrastructure building with a new approach, stopping newts and bats from blocking construction. Attempts to complete projects such as to build roads and power plants have ended up in recent years being marred by legal challenges, which the Labour government is seeking to address. NIMBYs, which stands for Not in My Backyard, refers to people who oppose building in their area. The Prime Minister says for too long, blockers have had the upper hand in legal challenges, using our court processes to frustrate growth. As part of the government's plans, so-called unarguable cases will only be able to be brought back to courts once rather than 3 times. The Housing Minister earlier told GB News that today's actions will help to bring down energy bills. And all schools in Northern Ireland have been advised to close tomorrow amid a rare red warning for wind issued by Storm Eowyn. Dangerous conditions are expected, with the top-level warning for wind issued for parts of Scotland as well. It's set to hit the country with gusts of up to 100 miles per hour. There are even warnings of possible tornadoes in the south of England today. The Met Office has advised people to secure loose items outside homes, as there could be a danger to life caused by flying debris. Those are the latest GB News headlines for now. More in half an hour.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 5 minutes past 1, and we're going to return straight to the case of the sentencing of Axel Rudikabana. Joining us is our Home and Security Editor, Mark White, with more.
We are now in the process of a lunch break at the court, having heard really some quite harrowing and disturbing evidence throughout the morning, and of course this very disruptive behaviour from Axel Rudikabana as well while he was in court. I'm joined by my colleague Sophie Reaper, who's been in court for us here at Liverpool Crown Court. Sophie, tell us first of all about the delay initially, then Axel Rudikabana coming up to the dock and what happened.
Well, we initially understood that Axel Rudikabana wouldn't be coming up to the dock today. That was something that we heard in court, and that was what we believe caused that such a delay. It was almost an hour past the point of where it should have started. However, then, much to, I think, many of our surprise, he did end up being brought up to the dock, and initially he put his head in his hands. He was in that grey prison tracksuit and the blue surgical mask, as we've seen him in previously. But then, all of a sudden, he started to shout. He was very, very emotional. He was shouting. He was ill. He needed to see a paramedic. He then started shouting at the prosecution, "Do not continue, do not continue." The defence then spoke to the judge directly and said that his client hadn't eaten for several days, had hardly had anything to drink, and that it was likely he was feeling the pressure too much. However, the judge ordered them to continue. But after Axel Rudikabana continued to shout at the judge to stop ignoring him, he needed to see a paramedic, even that his chest was hurting, eventually the judge was forced to send him from the dock. And
it just proved all too much for the families. Clearly,
of course,
the father of Alice.
Yes, we heard Alice's father shout that he was a coward. Many of the other families visibly upset. Of course, they want to see justice served. We have seen justice served, but we are supposed to see him sentenced later today. And of course, you would understand the families wanting to see the young man who has caused so much hurt, so much distress for them. They would want to see him sentenced in the flesh.
And I mean, clearly, we reported earlier reports that he'd actually been taken to hospital. Merseyside Police have since confirmed that that actually wasn't the case, but might go some way to explaining why the Press Association reported that initially. These reports from the defence that he'd clearly not been eating, he'd not been drinking, that he said he was feeling unwell. But regardless of this is a young man who's shown utter contempt for the legal process right from the very beginning here, and that was on display in spades today.
Well, utter contempt across the board. Of course, we heard from police in the past couple of days that, in fact, when he was arrested and taken into custody, that he was heard saying he was glad, he was happy those children were dead. Truly sick, disturbing comments there from Axel Rudikabana. But once he was removed from the dock, the judge ordered that he be seen by a medical professional. A few moments later, we heard that he had been seen and that medical professional was happy with the state he was in, but that they wanted a second opinion. I think that's going to be heard not in open court, but we're predicting that Rudikabana will be in the dock. That's certainly what the judge intimated to the defence, that they wanted to see Rudikabana back in the dock following this lunch break.
Even if that results in him kicking off in the dock again, putting the families through that ordeal once again?
This is the issue that we see time and time again at sentencings, isn't it, Mark, with defendants refusing to come up, because ultimately that is what they are able to do. We've seen it already this morning that Rudikabana was able to kick off to such an extent that the judge was ultimately left with no option but to remove him, so that we could get on with the business of sentencing. Of course, we've heard the prosecution's case so far this morning. That will likely continue in the afternoon session, but that is the situation we find ourselves in. Ultimately, he could continue to kick off, and then it becomes a matter for the judge to deal with.
Well, let's put Axel Rudikabana to one side at the moment in terms of his behaviour in the dock. What we did get, of course, was the barrister for the Crown Prosecution Service putting the case in summary form that would have been put to a jury had this gone to that full trial, before him, of course, pleading guilty at the beginning of the week. And really, of course, as understandable, disturbing evidence coming through.
Yes, we see a lot in this job, Mark. We see a lot of disturbing and upsetting and emotional cases like this, but I have to say, candidly, this is one of the most horrific things I've ever seen and heard. That CCTV footage of the moments leading up to attack of Axel Rudikabana entering the building, of the moments during the attack, of it taking place, seeing those little girls flee from their attacker in the building, and seeing quite visceral images of them, some of them stumbling away from the building. We saw one particular child try to escape, and we saw Axel Rudikabana pull her back in, a child aged between 7 and 11, we know. Truly one of the most horrific things I've ever seen. We also saw the moments where the police entered the building, and that when Axel Rudikabana was detained. Of course, to that, there were brief pauses throughout this to allow family members and other people in the court the opportunity to leave, because as I'm sure our viewers can understand, this is incredibly harrowing footage to have to bear witness to, particularly for those who have children who were involved in it. So there were those brief pauses allowed to allow them to leave the room, but for those who stayed, including Alice's parents, you could see that they were visibly broken by seeing this footage, and there's no surprise there. It was truly horrific.
Yeah, I mean, you can absolutely understand why some family members just would not want to put themselves through that. Of course, you didn't have the chance, the luxury to leave court. You had to be there for us to bear witness to that, and it is horrible and traumatic, and we feel for you in having to watch that, but clearly it had to be done to try to give us an impression as best you can of what happened in the Heart Space Centre. Now, we are not going into the individual graphic details of what happened to each and every one of those girls, because it is just too traumatic, and for
well, that's
taste
what CPS have asked for,
and
us
of
not
course,
to do that for the
and
family's
the families
sake.
have asked
Yes.
for that, for taste and decency reasons. We're doing that. This is not part of any attempt to in any way, shape or form cover up from the horrific nature of what took place there. You described that, the very fact that there was that CCTV of these young girls screaming in distress coming out of that building, Sophie, it's just unimaginable.
Absolutely, and I think that it's, I'm absolutely fine, and I'm more than happy to be the kind of person in there who brings these horrific details out so that people at home know exactly what Axel Rudikabana did that day in July last summer. But for those families, I can't even begin to comprehend what they're dealing with, and moreover what they will continue to deal with, because of course those 3 little girls that lost their lives, their families have lost a child forever, but also those families of victims who received multiple stab wounds. When you hear about children under the age of 11 receiving multiple stab wounds, and I'm not talking 2 or 3, I'm talking in the 30s, in the 40s. These are small children. That is essentially, when you think about it, it is all over the body, and the life-changing injuries they have received, you can't even begin to imagine how horrific it is for those families. Words don't even begin to cover it, in my opinion, Mark. It is truly one of the most devastating things, and I think that this is something that will change the landscape of how people perceive this kind of attack going forward, because it is one of the most horrific things certainly I've ever covered in my career. I imagine it will be up there for you. And it's just shocking. That is the word of the day. It is shocking. I can't believe I was prepared going into this that it would be horrific. The police had warned us, Crime Prosecution Service had warned us, but I don't think anyone in there really could grasp just how horrendous it was going to be. There were gasps. There was obviously crying from the other side of the room from the families, and I think. It's just, I'm sure you can see, I'm obviously visibly upset by it, because it is upsetting that these 3 little girls, all of these little girls, they went to a Taylor Swift dance class to dance and enjoy their summer holiday, to make friendship bracelets, and instead, 6 months down the line, we're here stood outside Liverpool Crown Court talking about the fact that 3 of them were murdered and many more of them were stabbed and left with life-changing injuries. It is just incredibly traumatic and incredibly distressing.
And the fact we're struggling, it doesn't even begin to.
I don't want anyone to think about me. I want to think of the families
of
today.
the families who are having to deal with this.
Yes.
Let's talk about some of the other evidence, because such a you know, we are such an interconnected world now, and CCTV is everywhere, even in the likes of the taxi that Axel Rudakabana took to the Heart Space Centre. We saw him in the back of that taxi, surgical face mask on, arriving at the centre, refusing clearly to pay the taxi driver. That's the least of his worries. Just talk us through that point there as he jumps out of the car.
Well, I think Merseyside Police have really conveyed, as you say, in this new age, having this CCTV and dashcam footage, it really allowed them to build that case, because we're able to see CCTV of him walking toward that taxi. We're able to see CCTV footage, dashcam footage, of him in the taxi driver, and we hear him ask the driver. He's silent for the entire journey, but when he arrives on Hart Street, he is clearly heard asking for 34A, which we now know is the location where that dance class was taking place. This isn't as if he turned up at a random street and picked a random building. He knew he was going to 34A, where those little girls, those vulnerable little girls, would be.
That's a very important point to put across here, because it's certainly the viewpoint of the authorities, although they've never been able to find any record of it electronically. It's their belief that he's somehow been able to research this individual event, that he targeted this specifically. He didn't just stumble upon this by chance. He knew, as you say, exactly where he was going.
He knew what he was doing. It was planned, and that is the word that they've used. Is it was calculated, it was planned, it was premeditated. But we see him arrive at the location, and once he's asked about where 34A is, you hear the taxi driver ask cash or card, as a taxi driver always would. But instead, Axel Rudakabana simply just opens the door and gets out. The taxi driver then actually follows Rudakabana in his vehicle, and therefore we have the dashcam footage of him initially going to a body shop where a member of staff there challenges him and tells him to pay the taxi driver. He then says, "What are you going to do about it?" We then see him walk along, again past the taxi and towards the Heart Space studio. We then see the taxi driver pull up, and the dashcam footage shows him attempt one door, which he's unable to get through, and then he walks along, and we see him go up a set of stairs, and within 20 to 30 seconds you start to hear those screams, and that is when you know that attack has begun, and that is when I think everyone in the court really began to feel a sense of exactly what had been carried out that day. And then a few moments later we start to see one young girl come out of the door, and then several others, and suddenly there's a stream of them all running and screaming, and then we saw the CCTV. I won't go into too much detail, obviously out of respect of the victims and their families, but of some of the young girls suffering with wounds. As I said before, we saw one young girl try to come out of the door, but she is pulled back in by Rudakabana. We then see footage from Police One footage of them entering the building and detaining Rudakabana. We also see them opening a toilet where one member of staff and another little girl were hiding from Rudakabana. We hear their reactions, their upset, but also their relief, because when they're found, Rudakabana is but meters away from them. So you can hear the sheer relief in their voice that the police have managed to get to them first.
Just unbelievable, the imagery that you are presenting here for us without seeing the CCTV. You've explained it so well, and I mean, I saw some of the imagery as well. We put together a background report that we will have on GB News once the sentencing is complete. The image of the taxi arriving, of him getting out of the taxi, and one thing that really just stopped me in my tracks was the fact as he went up to the door to go into Heart Space, you could hear the music from inside. The 25 young children dancing away to Taylor Swift music,
It's
unaware
contrast,
of the evil that was about to descend.
It is the complete polar opposite. And that is what Merseyside Police have described it as. Those little girls in there, they are the complete polar opposite of the evil that entered the Heart Space that day. You hear the music, you know that inside they were making friendship bracelets, they were singing along to their idol, and yet seconds later Axel Rudakabana would enter with that knife and begin one of the worst attacks, certainly that Southport has ever seen, but I would go as far as to say the UK has ever ever seen.
And of course, it's also going to be incredibly difficult to hear after lunch, as we're expecting, if the prosecution has sort of concluded the timeline of events, a summary of the attack itself. We'll go onto the victim impact statements, and that will be heart-wrenching, because we'll hear from those family members, such as the father of Alice da Silva Aguirre, about the loss, the profound loss that they feel.
I think victim impact statements are always one of the most difficult bits in court, but we will of course be bringing you all that latest as we get it later on this afternoon. But I think it is something that is going to be incredibly emotional for everyone in the building today.
Well, Sophie Reaper, thank you so much for all of the work that you've done inside the court and bringing forth such harrowing evidence and explaining it so incredibly well in as sensitively a way as possible, given the very nature of what was unfolding there. And as I say, later on, once we get the sentencing, some of that video, some of the very impactful details will be in a background report to this case, but clearly an awful lot more that Sophie has had to sit through in court.
Thank you so much, Mark White, and of course to Sophie Reaper. That can't have been easy to be inside the court hearing all those horrific details. Just the fear, how terrified those people must have been at that moment.
No, it's absolutely shocking, but do stay with us here on Good Afternoon Britain, because we are your one-stop shop for all things Southport. We'll be back outside the court and talking to experts across this case. That sentencing resuming, of course, in just some moments' time. Next, we'll be speaking to a former prison governor turned best-selling author on what might be in store for Rudakabana.
Martin Daubney, weekdays from 3 p.m.
First, mate, we had lockdowns. Then we had soaring energy costs. Then we had a hike in national insurance for employers. Then we had soaring wage costs. And now the government expects people like you to monitor what people say in boozers. And if you don't, you might get sued. I bet you feel like saying cheers to them, don't you?
Look, it just looks like another war on pubs, you know. Remember, they tried to stop smoking outside as well. Luckily, they rethought that. But look, we've got everything stacked against us, Martin, and the last thing I need to do is go and get in people's conversations. At the end of the day, a pub is like an extension to your home. You know, it's a public house. Friends go to speak. Friends go to meet, unwind after work. It's none of my business what you're talking about. Any good publican, and myself included, anyone that was rude to anyone or on purpose, they want to offend people or they want to dig people out, antagonise them, of course I'm going to step in and say, behave yourself or you go. But look, how can I be on social media talking about everything, transgender, immigration, and people not be allowed to do that at the bar or do that at the table of a pub? It's ridiculous. And these ministers really do need to sort of look at this legislation and see where it could lead, because I'm not going to stop anyone speaking in my pub. Again, if they're trying to antagonise people or they're rude or trying to start trouble, they get thrown out the front door, and any publican worth their salt is going to do that as well. But we're not there to police people's conversations.
GB News, the People's Channel.
I'm Christopher Hope. From pop stars to politicians, I'll interview anybody in a pub who's got a political opinion. Join me every Friday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube or gbnews.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is GB News, the People's Channel.
If you want your news to be straight talking, this is a nightmare for the Conservatives again. Down to earth. It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it? And most importantly, honest. Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get their book thrown at them. Then catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Headliners on GB News 11 p.m. every night. It's got 3 top comedians going through the next day's newspapers so you don't have to read them, which is great.
That's a good point. He's lying. Maybe he's not lying.
That's Headliners every night from 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. as well on GB News, Britain's news channel.
OK, well, good afternoon, Britain. We're going to return to our top story today. Southport killer Axel Rudabukana is being sentenced for the killing of 3 young girls today.
Well, joining us now is the retired prison governor and best-selling author Vanessa Frake. Vanessa, thanks so much for being with us today. I'm interested in what Axel Rudabukana could be expecting once this sentencing is concluded. Of course, he committed this awful crime just 9 days away from his 18th birthday. He's also now at the age of 18, under the age of 21. All of these different considerations. What might a life in prison look like for Axel Rudabukana?
Well, first of all, I think we need to look at his category. I assume from the police escort to the court this morning that he is already a Category A prisoner, which means that he's considered to be a high risk, a danger to the public, and possibly a threat to national security. So his category should stay the same because it is a very high-profile case. Secondly, we'll look at where he's likely to be housed. Now, he's 18. He will probably be in a prison that holds 18 to 25-year-olds. But in exceptional circumstances, he may indeed go to an adult prison. But that's for the prison authorities to decide down the line. Because of his offence and the dreadful crimes that he committed against Alice, BB, Elsie and the other children and adults in Southport, it is likely that he will be offered Rule 45, which is a protection rule. So he'll likely end up on a vulnerable prisoner unit with others that have committed crimes against children, rape and that sort of thing. It's certainly that because his face has been plastered everywhere over the media, that it is likely that he will have to look over his shoulder for the rest of his life, I would imagine, because somebody will undoubtedly try and get to him.
Yeah, may well be prisoners who would like nothing more than to do that. Is there any chance that he might be held in isolation?
He could well be, but prison authorities, I mean, he can ask for segregation under the rule, but, you know, prison authorities won't want him to spend his entire life in segregation. At some stage, he will be looked at being put on a wing with other undesirables such as himself.
What will his day-to-day life be like in a Category A prison? You say that maybe sometime where he's on in this unit for the vulnerable criminals that are in prison. Will he have a television? Will he have access to the internet? What will he be doing day by day?
Well, that'll all depend on him, on his sentence plan, what the prison and other multidisciplinary teams deem suits him. So no, he won't be have any access to the internet. No prisoner does. He will have a TV unless he chooses not to. That's a privilege, so that can also be taken away. A lot of it, of course, depends on his behaviour in prison as to what he can do and what he can't do. If he abides by the prison rules, then he is likely to have some sort of education work. He'll get sort of tests from the education department to see that he can read and write to an acceptable level. He may be offered some types of cognitive behaviour therapy with regards his crimes. He may well be looked at to see his ideologies and why he committed crimes. But of course, that all depends if he toes the line and communicates with the various multidisciplinary teams in jail. And could I just point out one thing about the fact that he's stating that he's ill? Every single prisoner who goes to court, no matter whether it's a magistrate's court or a Crown court, the day before, they are seen by a doctor to ensure that they're fit for court. And he will have been seen by a doctor at the prison that he's at, and he will have been deemed fit to attend court.
So it's highly likely that he was just wanting to be obstructive to proceedings. Now, killers of children and paedophiles are considered the lowest of the low within prison, aren't they? Other prisoners will be looking down on him for his particular crime, whatever crime they happen to have committed. It could be a very dangerous place for him as well, prison.
Undoubtedly, yes. I mean, look, it's he is the maker of his own doing. The crimes were so unbelievably heinous that nobody's going to forget him, his face, or his crimes. And yes, there is a pecking order within prisons, and child killers, child molesters, child rapists are seen as the lowest of the low. And if you look at somebody like Ian Huntley, he's been slashed several times in jail because they have a bounty on their head. And as I said, he will indeed spend most of his remaining time in jail, however long that may be, and I hope that it's very, very long, looking over his shoulder.
Well, let's hope that he develops some sort of twitch looking over his shoulder, and I, for one, won't cry if someone does attempt some prison justice, but perhaps that's stepping over a line or two. Vanessa Frake, thank you so much for talking us through what is a fascinating situation. We'll be following, of course, the sentencing very, very closely. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it seems unlikely he's going to suddenly develop a conscience, but you never know. This is Good Afternoon Britain on GB News. We have, of course, got a lot more coming up on today's show. We're going to be joined by former Minister of State for Crime, Policing and Fire, Tom Pursglove, very soon on this very story.
Emily, thank you. Well, of course, as you have just been hearing, the judge at the sentencing hearing for child killer Axel Rudakabana has ordered him to be removed from the court as he shouted repeatedly, saying to the judge, "I need to see a paramedic because I feel ill." A warning viewers may find some of the following details distressing. The sentencing hearing was initially slightly delayed as GB News understands he'd refused to enter the court. The prosecution told the court that whilst he was in custody, he'd said, "I'm glad they're dead." Alice De Silva Aguirre, BB King and Elsie Dot Stankham were all murdered in that vicious knife attack last July. The court was shown a picture of the murder weapon, a 20-centimetre kitchen knife. BB and Elsie both died at the scene. Alice was rushed to hospital where, quote, her heart stopped beating. Prosecutors have said the injuries they suffered are difficult to explain as anything other than sadistic in nature. The court heard that many were inflicted to the back of the victims, suggesting they were inflicted as the victims were trying to escape. Rudakabana also was sentenced for producing a biological toxin and being in possession of a PDF named the Al-Qaeda Training Manual. It's emerged he was known to authorities, but they all failed to intervene. Downing Street earlier indicated nothing is off the table to protect children when asked what actions would be taken to enforce that Sir Keir Starmer's promise of tougher rules on online knife sales. And some breaking news this hour. A 14-year-old being questioned about the murder of Birmingham schoolboy Leo Ross and an attack on a pensioner has been further arrested in connection with two other assaults. That is coming into the newsroom from West Midlands Police. More on this breaking story just as soon as we get it. Those are the latest news headlines for now. More in half an hour.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Time for your latest weather update from the Met Office here on GB News. Storm Eowyn will arrive tonight, bringing damaging gusts of wind during tomorrow. A Met Office red warning across Northern Ireland has been issued. The storm itself is developing out in the Atlantic at the moment, really intensifying. Before it arrives today, a spell of wet and windy weather for all of us from this weather front. There's a Met Office yellow warning in place for the gust of wind around the west coast of Wales and across southern England. Spell of wet weather sweeping through, blustery conditions, but cheering up a little this afternoon for much of Wales, southern England, seeing some sunny spells, staying fairly soggy over northern England and Scotland, with more snow to come over the tops of the hills, but mostly it is just rain. Brighter skies means it is turning slightly milder across the southwest, but still fairly gusty and blustery. Still some more wet weather to come in across Scotland well into this evening. As I said, a little bit of snow over the tops of the hills, but nothing too much to concern us with that. But it'll tend to clear away as we go through the night. Some drier and clearer conditions for a time across Northern Ireland, but very different ends to today compared to how tomorrow will start, because Storm Eowyn is, even by this evening, getting into parts of southern Ireland. Damaging gusts of wind swinging in here through the course of the night. Spell of heavy rain as well, with some hill snow mixed in, but it really is the winds we're most concerned about, picking up right across these western areas, and then another intense zone of strong winds coming in across the west of Ireland through the really first part of Friday morning. That is likely to swing across Northern Ireland during tomorrow morning's rush hour. The storm system, you can see it there, then heads its way up across western Scotland with damaging gust of wind, then likely across parts of southwest and central Scotland. But a very gusty, blustery Friday morning everywhere. Across much of England and Wales, it actually turns a bit brighter. There are a number of Met Office warnings in place, including that red warning. Please do check the Met Office website for full details.
The latest GB News travel.
Good afternoon, I'm Russell Holding. In West Yorkshire, the A63 is closed each way along Selby Road in Micklefield after an accident yesterday afternoon. In Lancashire, the A584 is blocked eastbound by an accident between Freckleton and Clifton, causing delays. On the M66 in Greater Manchester, there's a lane closed northbound just after junction 2 at Bury after an accident causing queues. In Conway, the A470 is partly blocked by an accident on the Royal Welsh Way off the A55 at the Llandudno junction, causing queues. In Staffordshire, the A500 is blocked southbound by an accident at the A52 City Road interchange in Stoke-on-Trent, causing delays. Trains have been stopped between Llandovery and Llandrindod because of a fallen tree on the line. On the M25 in Berkshire, the outside lanes close clockwise just after junction 15 for the M4 after an accident, and P&O sailings between Dover and Calais are suspended because of strike action in Calais. That's the latest.
You can stay up to date throughout the day by visiting our website, gbnews.com.
Good afternoon, Britain. At 1:37 in the afternoon, we're going to return to our top story now. The Southport killer, Axel Rudakabana, is being sentenced for the killing of 3 young girls this summer.
Yes, and joining us now is the former Minister of State for Crime, Policing and Fire, Tom Pursglove. Tom, thank you very much indeed for joining us in the studio. Just hearing from our reporter there some of the details from inside that court, it almost doesn't bear thinking about. Of course, people are hoping for the toughest sentence possible. He did commit the crime at 17, so it may well be more lenient than it might otherwise be. What are your thoughts?
I think that the detail that you've been reporting and other media outlets are reporting this afternoon is just chilling, and it's impossible not to just think about those poor families who are living this, and hearing all of that detail today. It just is so moving, isn't it? And I think all of us want to see justice for them. And it's right that those legal proceedings today take their course, and that they take their course in a way that is unhindered. But I do think that if there is learning that comes out of this case in relation to sentences, that is something that ministers should look at, because I do think that any right-minded person would want to see the most stringent sentence handed down in this case, but also to make sure that moving forward that the public's protected from this individual.
I mean, it's quite clear that this was a calculated killer. From everything that we've heard, this was something that had been planned for a long time. This is someone who read up on how to commit terrorist acts, read that Al-Qaeda manual that we've all spoken about so much. Do you think it's possible that in a completely compos mentis way, this individual decided to do this killing just 9 days before his 18th birthday because he knew the law would be more lenient towards him than if he'd have done it 9 days later?
I think it's impossible to understand the motivations and to be able to relate to anything that has happened and why someone would behave in that way, to take the lives of young children who were at a party enjoying being together. It's impossible to understand that mindset. And one thing that is clear, however, is that the individual responsible for this has ruined his life, has made the lives of his own family and friends and those around him impossible and unbearable in so many respects, that you often wonder that whether a consideration like that would not even come into it, because they're acting in such an appalling way. What drives you to behave like that in the first place?
Yeah, so hard to know. I mean, it could possibly have been a calculation. I mean, who knows? We know that he pleaded guilty very last minute. There was probably a calculation there as well to try and get a little bit off his sentence or for some kind of leniency. Just hearing that the Labour MP for Southport has spoken out on this, he says he would like to see a law change which could allow for whole life sentences in cases like this, because, yes, he can be given a life sentence with a minimum term, which is what he'll probably get, but he can't be given a whole life order because of his age.
And I think the key consideration in this also has to be justice for the victims and their families, but also protecting the public going forward. And it seems very difficult to me to even begin to conceive that this individual wouldn't be a danger to the public at some point in the future. And I think this will undoubtedly be an area that ministers want to look at, as well as that wider
Tom,
public
this is why the story is just so devastating in the detail. For years, this monster, man, whatever you want to call him, was exhibiting violent behaviour, threatening behaviour. He was expelled from school after bringing in a knife multiple times. He turns up at the school again with a hockey stick to try and cause harm. He then has he's referred to Prevent, but he's also with the social services. He goes through some kind of rehabilitation scheme, but then continues to be violent. They try to send him to some specialist schools because of his autism. He never gets reintegrated into the education system. His parents clearly have no idea what to do. I mean, that needs to be investigated, in my opinion. So many failures. And then yesterday, we're reporting on the discussion around whether knives are too available on Amazon. I mean, just so many failures. It's hard to know where to start.
And I'm sure
this could have been prevented.
And I think that's the key thing here that just shouldn't be lost in this, because there are undoubtedly processes that retailers, I'm sure, will want to look at about what more they can do to be more rigorous and robust and making sure that offensive weapons aren't being sold to individuals who ought not to have them. But crucially, the thing that we can't get away from in this case is that there has been an enormous state failure, and we ought to call it that, because that is precisely what has happened. And it seems to me, and without having all of the detail, and that's why the public inquiry is right to understand this, but it would seem to me on the face of it that the sort of join-up and the grip of these sorts of cases, bearing in mind that this individual is only just an adult, a lot of this was going on while they were a child. So what safeguarding, what prevention, what work was going on, working across the agencies who ought to have been stepping in to deal with this in a coordinated, joined-up way to ensure that something like this could never have happened in the first place.
Now, of course, you've been a Home Office minister. You'll know how that slightly dysfunctional department works. Do you think it's a displacement activity for the Home Secretary this week to be talking about age restrictions for buying kitchenware rather than the failures that you and I have just been talking about, the failures of the Prevent programme, the failures to detect? Well, I mean, it wasn't even a failure to detect. Everyone had detected it. It's a failure to act upon the detection of a violent and dangerous man.
I think that in cases like this, those kind of case conferences, bringing together those key organisations that are responsible for trying to resolve these issues is so important, and the accountability that sits alongside
Is the focus on the knife itself a distraction?
I think it's impossible to discount the importance of that. It's clearly a factor. This individual had these products that they then used in this appalling criminality, so we can't ignore that. But I do think that it shouldn't act as a distraction
know, Tom, that
away.
he could have got it from his own family kitchen, or he could have got it from a friend's kitchen.
That is quite possible.
You know?
But and perfectly conceivable. But that's not to say that we shouldn't act if there is more that we can do to improve the processes with those retailers. I think the key thing in all of this, though, goes back to how cases work together.
But we can't all be expected to show our Face ID to buy a kitchen knife. I mean, that's ridiculous.
I think there's a fair point in that you raise, and this needs to be worked through carefully. But that's not to say that there aren't things that retailers could practically do to just improve these processes, particularly where children are trying to purchase items. But crucially, it does come back to what more can be done to make sure that agencies, whether they be local or national, work more constructively together, and actually that there is grip around individual cases, that where these flags arise, they are dealt with robustly. Because in the end, when these things escalate, they end up in the most appalling, senses. The consequences of that are just enormous, and we've seen that again with this case.
Well, Tom Pursglove, former Home Office Minister, really appreciate your time here talking through what is a horrific case that we're continuing rolling coverage here on GB News all afternoon on. So don't go anywhere, because we're going to be back to the court, to Liverpool Crown Court, after this very short break.
GB News Breakfast, every day from 6 a.m.
Now, we're going to introduce you to Liam Wildish. Liam, well, I'd like to think he's a friend of mine because I follow him on Instagram, on TikTok there as well.
You're a big fan, aren't you?
Big fan, because there's what he does. He's a cleaner. He cleans signs. But the thing is, he's not employed by councils or whatever. He does this voluntarily. And you sort of think to yourself, well, who cleans these signs? Why have these signs been allowed to get into this terrible state of disrepair and filthiness?
So, basically, long story short, about 6 years ago, I used to be a window cleaner. In the community where I lived, I noticed all of the road signs were filthy, and I was perfectly equipped to clean them. So, basically, I cleaned the road signs as a bit of a thank you to the community and sort of make a little bit of awareness of my window cleaning business at the time. Yeah. Sort of cleans up the area, makes the road safer, and that's kind of how that started. And people found it like a really satisfying sort of approach. So that sort of led on to today of a video in cleaning the dirty road signs and making sort of satisfying content with it as well.
What is the equipment? What have we got here?
So this is a water-fed pole system connected to a backpack, which is what feeds the water through the end of the brush there. It's perfectly equipped to basically remove this green dirty, it's like a mildew build-up that you get on the signs. Yeah. As you can see, this is like extremely effective at removing so.
So GB News viewers, if they spot a particularly grisly sign in their area, then they can get in touch.
They can do, yeah.
And Liam Wildish, the sign guy, can sort you out.
If you find Liam the sign guy online, drop me a message, let me know, and I'll add you to my list of places.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Mornings don't have to be tiresome, especially if you have the right company.
Wake up to news as it happens, opinion and debate, and of course, a little bit of entertainment too.
Because when the kettle's on, we're on.
That's Breakfast on GB News, a show worth waking up for.
Every morning from 6 a.m.
Only on the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We'll spread the news, you spread the word.
In the GB newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK,
we're ready to keep you up to date with what's happening every half an hour, every single day. Bulletins here on GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
I'm Stephen Dixon, and thanks for joining us on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It is now almost 10 to 2, and we're returning to our top story of today. The Southport killer Axel Rudikabana is being sentenced for the killing of 3 young girls and the attempted murder of 10 more.
So we're joined now by GB News Home and Security Editor Mark White, who's in Liverpool for us outside the Crown Court. Mark.
Well, I have to say I'm still stunned by the powerful interpretation of the evidence that she saw in court from our correspondent Sophie Reaper, who had to sit through the most harrowing of evidence and descriptions of what happened on that day on the 29th of July last year, and of course also see CCTV images of that event unfold, and some of it is just too graphic, and at the request of the families we're not going into details about the graphic nature of some of the injuries, understandably, but of course that doesn't stop us highlighting.
Sorry, can I just highlight to the audience, Mark, that we're seeing fresh pictures now, sketches from within the courtroom, pictures just sketched in the last hour or so of Axel Rudicabanner. We can see his hands waving in this particular picture, his hair in this sort of manic, crazed upwards trend, and that COVID mask on his face too. Sorry to interrupt you, Mark. I just wanted to highlight these are new pictures that we're seeing from inside the courtroom.
Yes, absolutely. So these were pictures that were sketched by a court artist at the point where Axel Rudicabanner was eventually persuaded to go up into the dock. It seemed he was reluctant to do that for about half an hour or so when he was supposed to go up and start listening to the sentencing hearing, but he was not up there long at all until it was clear he was determined to be as disruptive as possible. And as the prosecutor began summarising the case that would have been put to the court had this gone to a full trial, he started, after mumbling initially, having his head in his hands, he started saying, "I'm ill." And according to Sophie Reaper, she said that he was actually shouting at the top of his voice, "I'm ill, I can't go on, stop the proceedings, I need medical attention," saying that he had issues with his chest as well. It continued. The prosecutor tried to speak over him, tried to continue with the evidence, but it became so disruptive that the judge decided that he should be taken from the dock and back down to the cells. It was at that point that the father of Alice de Silva Aguirre, Sergio, shouted "coward" at Axel Rudicabanner as he was led down to the cells. Now he's received, we're told, medical attention, has been seen by medics who have apparently declared him fit enough to go back in to the dock. So we'll see this afternoon whether he's likely to be any more compliant. I doubt it, to be honest, but this afternoon's evidence about to get underway before the sentencing of this young man.
Mark White, thank you very much for being there outside the courtroom for us. And of course, Sophie Reaper, our reporter inside the courtroom, we will be reporting on every moment as it happens when that court resumes at 2 o'clock.
Yes, so we will hear, or at least Sophie Reaper inside will hear from the victim impact statements, which I'm sure will be incredibly powerful and also quite moving, perhaps distressing too. And then we will eventually get the sentencing and hear what that will be, how many years he'll be spending in prison.
But crucially, Sophie is in constant communication with Mark White, so we will hear minute-by-minute updates in terms of what happens. Is Axel Rudicabanner going to be dragged back into the courtroom? What sort of disturbance might he make, or will he sit there and listen? It's all to come, it's all live, and we'll be hearing it minute by minute here on Good Afternoon Britain, so don't move a muscle.
Chilly start will give way to a lovely, warm afternoon. Boxed heat pumps, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Storm Eowyn is fast approaching. The Met Office have issued red weather warnings. We don't issue these lightly, and they're in place for Northern Ireland and parts of Scotland for damaging gusts of wind tomorrow. Here comes that storm, as I said, fast approaching. Ahead of it, we've seen this weather front provide some very heavy rain and gusty winds. That's now heading out into the North Sea, staying fairly soggy, though, well into the evening across parts of Scotland. Then drier for a time, but here comes Storm Eowyn, a spell of heavy rain accompanied by gusty winds, snow for a time across Northern Ireland, quite a bit of snow falling over the hills of Scotland during Friday. Temperatures actually probably rising through the night, but the winds will also be intensifying and getting particularly strong on Friday morning. We have a number of weather warnings in place. Those red warnings for Northern Ireland, central and southwest Scotland, gusts of 80, 90, perhaps even more than that in terms of miles an hour. In exposed areas, we could be close to 100 miles an hour. Particularly bad across Northern Ireland in the morning, that morning rush hour, and then the strongest winds transferring to southwest Scotland during the late morning and into the early part of the afternoon. But it's very windy everywhere. Damaging gusts also possible. We have the amber warning over parts of northern England and North Wales, and yellow warnings covering things further south, where it'll be a wet start for East Anglia and the southeast, but a much, much milder start than we've been used to. That rain will tend to pull away through the day. The winds will ease a little over England and Wales, and actually for many here it's a dry and a fine and a sunny day, but those dangerous gusts still continuing, easing maybe in Northern Ireland by lunchtime, but then into the southwestern corner of Scotland, and the very strong winds then transferring to northern Scotland later in the day. With some brightness, we could reach double figures for a time across the south, but obviously feeling cooler with those winds, which continue to cause problems across northern parts of Scotland. Please stay up to date with the forecast. You can see all of those warnings for yourself on the Met Office website. Bye for now.
A nice bright morning will generate a lovely warm day, right through to the evening. Boxed Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Imagine how £50,000 in cash from us could make your new year go with a bang.
Hi, my name's Victoria. I won the Spring Great British giveaway. So the day we got the money in our bank account, everything just felt a lot lighter. I would say if you'd be thinking about entering, just enter.
For another chance to win, text cash to 63232. One entry costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. Or text bonus to 63232. 5 entries cost £5 plus one standard network rate message. Go to gbnews.com/win. Entries start from just £2. You can call 0903 681 3232. Calls cost £2 plus your network access charge. Or post your name and number to GB10 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 6 p.m. on the 31st of January. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
Good Afternoon Britain isn't just about us. The wonderful thing about this programme is it's about everyone watching. It's an interactive programme.
Well, there absolutely is something to see here, and we're going to be talking about it more.
Whether it's breaking royal news, Will, please bring us up to date, or indeed a particularly punchy speech in the House of Commons.
Very, very curious.
We bring it to you live, and then we bring you live reaction as well.
That's Good Afternoon Britain, weekdays from midday.
Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Headliners on GB News 11 p.m. every night. It's got 3 top comedians going through the next day's newspapers so you don't have to read them, which is great.
That's a good point. He's lying. Maybe he's not lying.
That's Headliners every night from 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. as well on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Christopher Hope. From pop stars to politicians, I'll interview anybody in a pub who's got a political opinion. Join me every Friday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube or gbnews.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is GB News, the People's Channel.
Hi, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and my show is your opportunity to cut through all the noise and dive in headfirst to some robust debates. Ideas clash.
Situation, isn't it? Because the failure is...
You're deliberately avoiding my point. Nothing's held back.
And if you think this is the end of it, wait for more.
And we do not shy away from the difficult stuff. Sometimes I want to shake people and say, if only you understood. So join me on Jubes & Co. weeknights at 6 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Nana Akwe, for an informative, interactive news programme with a difference. It's fun.
No, he didn't say that, though.
I'm so surprised.
I think there's an element of truth to that.
Join me from 3 p.m. every weekend, only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 2 o'clock on Thursday, the 23rd of January. I'm Tom Harwood.
And I'm Emily Carver.
Well, dramatic scenes inside the Liverpool Crown Court as Southport killer Axel Rudakabana is removed at the sentencing hearing.
Yes, victims' families calling him a coward as the court is played pivotal moments back of the Southport tragedy.
Well, sentencing is due to resume now, and Axel Rudakabana could be brought back into the courtroom. We'll be following the updates and events live for you.
OK, yes, so there was an hour-long break to proceedings for lunch. Now those court proceedings will be resuming once again right about now.
And our woman in the room is, of course, Sophie Reaper, in constant contact with Mark White, who is outside Liverpool Crown Court for us. So over the course of this hour, we will give you as much information as is humanly possible in terms of what is going on inside that courtroom, particularly over the reactions to what Axel Rudakabana himself is doing. Might he be brought back into the courtroom? Might he make a disturbance again? Well, we'll find out this hour.
We will indeed. We'll be back in a second, but we'll bring you the news headlines now.
Emily, Tom, thank you very much. The top stories: the judge at the sentencing hearing for child killer Axel Rudakabana ordered him to be removed from the court as he shouted repeatedly, saying to the judge, "I need to see a paramedic because I feel ill." A warning viewers may find some of the following details distressing. The sentencing hearing was initially slightly delayed as GB News understands he'd refused to enter the court. The prosecution told the court that whilst he was in custody, he'd said, "I'm glad they're dead." Alice De Silva Aguirre, BB King and Elsie Stankham were all murdered in that vicious knife attack last July. The court was shown a picture of the murder weapon, a 20-centimetre kitchen knife. BB and Elsie died at the scene. Alice was rushed to hospital where, quote, her heart stopped beating. Prosecutors have said the injuries they suffered are difficult to explain as anything other than sadistic in nature. The court heard that many were inflicted to the back of the victim, suggesting they were inflicted as the victims were trying to escape. Rudakabana also was sentenced for producing a biological toxin and being in possession of a PDF named the Al-Qaeda Training Manual. It's emerged he was known to authorities, but they all failed to intervene. Downing Street indicated nothing is off the table to protect children when asked what actions would be taken to enforce Sir Keir Starmer's promise of tougher rules on online knife sales. The Metropolitan Police has been removed from special measures after more than 2 years as progress has been made, according to the watchdog. The force had been put into special measures following extensive criticism it faced after the death of Sarah Everard, who was abducted and murdered by a serving officer, Wayne Couzens. His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services said the Met has made a number of improvements, including in how quickly calls are answered, in professional standards and in investigating missing children. Elsewhere, The Telegraph has revealed London is home to an estimated 585,000 illegal migrants, making up 1 in 12 of the city's population. Concerns over border control failures and pressure on public services are growing, but official figures from the Home Office are not available. The study, commissioned by Thames Water, suggests there are over 1 million illegal migrants in the UK, 60% of those in the capital. The report suggests most illegal migrants arrived in the UK on work, study or visitor visas and then overstayed. And some breaking news this hour. British star Felicity Jones has been nominated for her first Oscar in more than a decade following her supporting role as Adrian Brody's wife in The Brutalist. Sir Elton John has achieved his 5th Oscar Original Song nomination after the release of his music documentary song Never Too Late. And Wicked star Cynthia Erivo has landed an Oscar nomination for Best Actress following her performance as Witch Elphaba in The Wizard of Oz. Much more on the Oscars throughout the day. Those are the latest headlines. More in half an hour.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Good afternoon, Britain. It is 4 minutes past 2, and the proceedings at Liverpool Crown Court are continuing for the sentencing of Axel Rudakabana. Outside the court is our Home and Security editor, Mark White, for us keeping abreast of what's going on. Mark, have they resumed once more now?
Not as yet, because, of course, so much of the disruption that was experienced throughout the morning, things running a little bit late. By the time they get everybody back in the court and the judge in there, and potentially the defendant now convicted after pleading guilty, Axel Rudakabana, back up into the dock, it could take some while. Now, I say expected for him to go back into the dock. That remains to be seen, because clearly during the course of the morning, when he was eventually persuaded to come up from the cells below the courtroom and into the dock, he was only in there seconds, and he was starting to complain that he was feeling unwell, got increasingly audible in his complaints that the proceedings shouldn't continue. The prosecutor in the case was determined to continue trying to lay out the facts before those gathered in the courtroom. But Axel Rudakabana started screaming that he was unwell, that he needed to see paramedics or medical attention, that he had chest pains, and eventually it got so disruptive that the judge decided he should be taken down away from the dock, back down into the cells and seen by a medical expert. Now, we understand that medics who have assessed this man have given him a clean bill of health in terms of his ability to go back into the dock, despite what the defence team were claiming, that this is a man who hasn't eaten for several days or drunk water in a while and was really quite ill. Medics, it seems, are happy enough for him to continue. But let's see if he is back in the dock, and let's see whether he continues to be as disruptive as he has been. At that point where he was eventually taken back down to the cells, we got one of the family members of the young girls who Axel Rudakabana murdered shouting out he could take no more, having listened to this individual, this murderer in the dock, screaming as he was, and he shouted after him, "Coward," as he was led out of the court and down to the cells. And understandable, family members were gathered in numbers in that courtroom to listen to what was going to be a very tough day anyway, listening to the evidence that would be put before the court had this gone to a full trial. Evidence that was presented in summary form, but no less distressing, no less impactful. And we heard, of course, just a little earlier from Sophie Reaper, our colleague who was in court, having to view that CCTV footage, having to listen to the evidence. And she said family members who decided to stay in court, because quite a few of them felt that they couldn't stay in court for this evidence as it was presented, and wanted to leave the court while that most graphic evidence was explored. Others who stayed, according to Sophie, were in bits, as was Sophie, understandably, listening to all of this evidence and viewing in particular the video that we saw, images of young girls running from that Heart Space venue where they had been attending this Taylor Swift themed dance class. 25 children and some adults inside that venue before Axel Rudakabana entered the building and began stabbing them in the most horrific manner. The families have asked us not to talk about the very graphic nature of some of the injuries that the girls suffered, having been stabbed multiple times, but we can of course tell you about the horrific nature of the event. The CCTV that showed, you know, these girls coming out screaming, panicking, bleeding, desperate for help, as the emergency services still at that point hadn't even arrived on scene. But when they did arrive, the scene that they were confronted with was a scene from hell. It was absolutely unbearable for even hardened first responders to try to deal with the number of traumatised and injured children that they were faced with. And in that mix, still on scene, was Axel Rudakabana after he'd stabbed those 3 young girls to death. He stabbed 8 others to their serious injury and stabbed, of course, 2 adults as well. Still on scene and arrested by members of the police service. And we know as well from some of the body camera footage that was there, Sophie spoke in very powerful terms about how, you know, an adult and 1 young child were hiding behind a door. And eventually when police opened the door, you could see on the body camera just how utterly relieved, distressed, of course, terribly distressed at what had happened, but how completely relieved they were to see someone like a police officer there to finally help them get away from that hellish nightmare.
I'm curious to know whether Axel Rudakabana's parents or any family members are there, or have they chosen to stay away, do we know?
I'm not aware of Axel Rudakabana's family members in court. I can't imagine that they would be near the court at this time, given the sensitivity of this case. It's certainly possible. I mean, it may be that arrangements have been made because there are some who are viewing proceedings via a video link that didn't want to come to court. It may be that they've been given access to that, but as I say, I'm not aware of that. And there are questions, it has to be said, for the family of this man to answer as well, but the authorities are not going anywhere near at this stage. And that's not because we haven't asked. We've asked repeatedly about what the family knew about his plans to carry out this deadly attack, because we can tell you that a week before the Southport stabbings, Axel Rudakabana had been attempting to get to his old high school in Formby in Merseyside, we believe, to carry out an attack there, or at least the authorities believe that was the case. He was persuaded, it seems, by his father, who intervened, who spoke to the taxi driver and pleaded with that taxi driver not to drive Axel Rudakabana the 15 miles to the Range High School, where it's believed this attack would have taken place. Somehow this man was talked down from that. The driver was persuaded not to take him, and Axel Rudakabana returned to his home address. But what did the father know? What did other members of the family know? Given clearly their concerns about where he was going and what he might do, did they have an inkling? It seems on the evidence presented that they may well have done, but we have had no indication from the police at this stage of any potential charges against members of this young man's family. They have just said it continues to be a live investigation and they're not prepared to talk about that at this stage. But I can tell you as well that in the family home was found the deadly toxin Rison, a quantity of which he had manufactured himself in there. The paraphernalia, the beakers for making this toxin were inside this young man's bedroom, recovered later by specialist officers. Contained in a Tupperware box was a quantity of this toxin that was later confirmed to be ricin at the government laboratory. There were also knives in this man's bedroom. There were arrows in this man's bedroom. There was a PDF that linked to research on Al-Qaeda and graphic detail within that research about terrorist planning, which is illegal, and of course subsequently resulted in him being charged with a terrorism offence, one of the 16 counts that he faced. So what exactly did the family of this young man know? We don't know as yet, but we may well, once this case is concluded today with the sentencing of Axel Rudikabana, hear more about what action, if any, family members may face.
Of course, one of those sentencings, one of these cases that will be remembered for years and years to come. There will be many calls for lessons to be learnt after the litany of failures that have been so apparent, even in the last couple of days, even before we've had the perhaps political questions that need to be asked in the wake of this sentencing. But Mark White, of course, the government has announced an inquiry into what went on in Southport. What do we know about the scope of that inquiry?
I'll get into that in a second. Sorry, and the reason I've been looking down is I'm in constant contact with our correspondent, Sophie Reaper, inside court, and she's confirmed that, of course, the proceedings are now underway. She has just said to me that medics have said Axel Rudikabana is fine. The defence says that he will come back and is willing to come back into the court and not disrupt proceedings. That is the defence that are telling the judge this. So we'll see whether he actually goes back into court. The judge has just said, no matter what, Axel Rudikabana will be in the dock for the actual sentencing. So even if it's just the sentence that's handed down, he will be in that dock to hear the time that he is to spend in prison, the sentence handed down by Mr. Justice Goose. Now we're being told Rudikabana is in the dock. Sorry, I'm just getting this as it's coming through from Sophie Reaper. Prosecutors are now going through the arrest, the search of the home, and what I've been just describing there, the recovery of the Rison, the PDF document, the background to this individual as well.
OK, so we now know that Axel Rudikabana, after having been taken out, ordered to leave the court by the judge, has now returned to the dock to, well, hear proceedings as they resume.
Yes, if I'm a little distracted, there's a bit of a protest to my left-hand side. It seems that colleagues from elsewhere within the media are receiving the attention of those protesters. And
Mark, is it related to this?
We'll just continue
is the protest related
to impart
to this?
The information.
Is the protest related to this case, or is it something else?
It is a protest related to this case. When I say protest, it's a group of people, a dozen or two strong, surrounding colleagues from another channel at the moment. So I'm going to continue, though, as long as I can, to impart the information that we have for you, that we're getting through our colleague in court, Sophie Reaper. And she is telling us that at the moment the prosecution continuing with its summarising of the case is going on to the point about what investigators found after Axel Rudikabana had been arrested and the search had begun of his home in Lancashire, and that of course uncovered that Rison toxin, uncovered the Al-Qaeda document, uncovered a number of weapons in this young man's bedroom as well. Some interesting and very disturbing evidence that came out in the summarised form this morning as well from the prosecutor, speaking about how, and we've said it throughout our coverage today, how he has been completely uncooperative. He has not in any way, shape or form been willing to deal with the legal process or the investigators around him. He's shown utter contempt for those legal proceedings. At no point did he answer any questions from investigators. However, in the custody suite, audio recordings in the custody suite, where of course you have CCTV and audio recordings anyway. Often, right, so I can just confirm some breaking news coming through from the courtroom. Axel Rudikabana has once again been removed from the dock, shouting again in the dock. He is now being taken down from the dock and back into the cells. I did say it was unlikely that this man, who's shown utter contempt for the proceedings that he is part of, would behave himself, and he's obviously intent on continuing to disrupt those proceedings. So he's out of the dock. It will continue. It's interesting, as I say, that the judge said he will be there no matter what happens to hear the sentence. Well, that might be possible, but if he comes back up to hear the sentence and all of that shouting is taking place, then clearly that's going to be also extremely disruptive. Normally we would be able, through a video feed, to hear the judge's remarks. I believe that will still be the case. However, knowing how these things work, it's on a delay. If there is disruption, I should warn you in advance that the court services will probably cut that feed because they want a judge's remarks to be heard. They don't want defendants or convicted criminals to be showboating effectively. So we will await what happens exactly. But the breaking news we can confirm to you is once again Axel Rudikabana, the man who has admitted murdering 3 young girls, to stabbing 8 other young girls and 2 adults, has once more been removed from the courtroom here at Liverpool Crown Court, from the dock, where he was brought back up from the cells, having been medically examined just a little earlier today because of illness that he said he was suffering. The judge directed that a medic should see him, assess him, speak to him. That medic said to the court that they were more than happy with him to go back into the dock, that there was nothing that precluded him from doing that. The judge then spoke to the defence team. The defence said that Axel Rudikabana was willing to come back up to court and that he would behave himself. Well, clearly he wasn't willing to behave himself. He is now back down into the prison cells.
OK, Mark White, thank you very much indeed. We'll leave you for a moment and come back with any other updates. But let's speak to journalist Nicole Lampert now, Nicole, you have some insight into how some of the family members of the victims of this awful, tragic triple murder might be feeling.
I've been speaking to a grandfather in particular of one of the surviving children about how they've been feeling. He contacted me quite a few months ago via social media because he was feeling like their story hadn't really been told after the murders. Obviously, it then became a story about the rioting and then about the anti-racism and the fact that 3 little girls had died and 8 other children had been severely hurt, was kind of left by the wayside. And I think he also felt that he wasn't being looked after as a grandparent. The authorities have looked after the parents, but the kind of adjoining people who are attached to those families, the aunts, the uncles, the grandparents, and even the step-parents, they haven't been getting the help. And this was a kind of, a man kind of desperately calling out that this is just kind of the latest of the kind of a whole cycle of litany of failures that you've been talking about, that, this was a young man who should have been shouldn't have ever been in a position that he was in to be able to do what he did, and still the failures continued.
So what is the message that this grandfather wants to get across? Well, to the authorities, no doubt, to the government, but also to the country.
I think what he said to me was he doesn't want a kind of lessons will be learned type message or discussion about what's going on about Amazon being able to sell knives, when obviously the perpetrator could have bought a knife a week later because he would have been 18, and anyone can pick up a knife from their kitchen. So he wants the focus be back on the families and what they've been through, and obviously listening to what's been happening in court. It's absolutely horrendous what these families have been living with, but also to make sure that it's not, even if there is an inquiry, it shouldn't just be yes, lessons will be learned and someone will get a slap on the wrist. Like, people have to. But this was someone who had been in trouble many times. He'd been referred to Prevent 3 times. What did people who were worried about him have to do to make sure he would never be in the position that he was, to murder and stab so many people so easily as well?
He's also quite distressed by how the conversation moved so quickly, of course, to the riots, understandably in a way, but the names of the innocent children that lost their lives almost fell by the wayside because the dominating story became the summer riots, became the far right, became those court cases that were put through the criminal justice system so quickly.
Yeah, and it became also, what he said to me was, that really stuck was the fact that I think they felt quite angry towards Keir Starmer, certainly at the start. He was seen to be giving more attention to the victims of the riots than the victims of the initial attack. He laid down flowers, and because there were people that were there where the flowers were, who were family members, and they were angry, they felt that there were questions that hadn't been answered. That Keir Starmer literally dropped the flowers, is what he said, that he was there for 19 seconds and then almost ran off. So I think, they felt from that was a kind of a symbol of what was going on, that the story then became the riots and it became about the far right. When I'm sure that, of course, there were far right people and they did some awful things. There was also by basically talking only about the far right, they didn't talk about this anger that people were feeling, including family members, that there was something there that they weren't being told. And of course, that we can't be told everything before a court case, but there were things that they should have been told to fit. Otherwise, it became this vacuum, this gap, and all this misinformation. Whereas he was known to authorities. There was a terror angle, even if it wasn't a terrorist attack. And of course, there's been lots of discussion about whether we now call this terrorism. In some ways, that's really important. In other ways, it's just because it doesn't come under the definition of terrorism doesn't mean it's not. Of course, it's a terror attack, isn't it? It's created to create terror. And this is someone who was radicalized on the internet. And it's not like this is the first person that we've seen who's been radicalized on the internet, even if he wasn't obviously far right or obviously Islamic fundamentalism. He was someone that was following that path of being radicalized on the internet, someone who'd been left alone. He'd been referred to Prevent 3 times. He'd been in trouble with the police. So there were all of these signs, and still nothing was done. And then that was ignored because they then talked about the far right riots, and now it's kind of being put on the wayside again as they're talking about Amazon and knives. And separately, we should be talking about knife crime. It's a massive issue. I live in London. I have teenage boys, and it's something that terrifies me. But that shouldn't be the discussion of today.
No, and certainly it's also the case that knife crime isn't a result of the existence of knives. Knife crime is a result of the existence of temperamentally violent and disturbed people who choose to use knives. And if it wasn't knives, they'd use screwdrivers. And if it wasn't screwdrivers, they'd use clubs or pointy sticks. I mean, we've seen this for millennia. But Nicole, I'm really interested in what the family thinks about this information vacuum that we've been discussing. We had on this show just a couple of days ago the former Attorney General, Sir Michael Ellis, who said that in his view, in his legal opinion, the government has been almost misinterpreting or over-interpreting the 1981 Contempt of Court Act, that there are some bits of information that could have been told to the public, that could have been told to the families, that would not be in contempt of this hearing, in contempt of court. I'm interested in terms of your conversations with the families. Do they feel that there was a cover-up in some way? I know it's an emotive term to use, but I have heard that expression used by many, many people here.
I think certainly, and obviously I've spoken to one family member. I think different family members will feel different things. But the families were told very early on, they were told around the 7th, 8th of August, depending on who was telling them, that there was going to be a terrorism charge and Rison had been found. And that did not make its way into the public arena till October, till the day of the budget. So I think they felt that they were almost being forced to lie, that there was something that they knew that should have been in the public eye, and as it was a charge, it wouldn't have, it wouldn't have affected contempt of court because it was going to be a charge. So, so there was definitely this vacuum, and of course we saw that all sorts of conspiracies were created in that vacuum. There were things that could have been told, and I think they definitely feel that. That there were reasons to stop this going out into the public eye, and and that part of that is possibly simply because Keir Starmer wanted to stop the riots, which is totally understandable. But perhaps if they'd been more open and honest with what they could say from the start, then there wouldn't have been the riots.
Perhaps we'll never know the answer to that for certain, 100% either way, but it's something that many, many people feel. Nicole Lampert, thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme and sharing that information with you, the experience of the grandfather, at least, of one of the victims there. Now, court proceedings are very much back underway after Axel Rudakabana was forced to leave the court yet again, only a few minutes after returning to the court from the dock. So there you go.
It is, of course, such a multifaceted issue. You've got all the failures of state, you've got all of the failures of authority in the years and months leading up to this horrendous attack. Then you've got, arguably, failures of authority in terms of being as open and transparent as they could have been in the days and weeks following the attack. And now we see what's going on in courts with the minute-by-minute updates we're getting from our journalists, both outside and inside the court, of the behaviour of Axel Rudakabana on not one but two occasions now, brought into the dock, shouting, screaming, demanding to see a paramedic, and then having to be taken out again.
And this attack is not as random as it first appeared on that fateful day. We're learning more and more about the history, the missed opportunities, the violence that he exhibited, the way he managed to fall through the cracks. But we're going to return to Mark White, who is still outside Liverpool Crown Court for us, our Home and Security editor, who's been following the court proceedings. Tell us what's happened in the last few minutes, then.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to imagine, isn't it, how he could fall through the cracks, given the amount of evidence that pointed to the very violent nature of this individual after multiple incidents dating back as far as 2019, when he was just 13 years old and took a knife to school. And we're just hearing more from inside court now. We're saying that on the 4th of October 29, Axel Rudakabana also called Childline. Now, he spoke to Childline about his desire to take a knife to go after what he described as racist bullies. He also asked them, what should I do if I want to kill somebody? Also told them he'd taken a knife to school. In fact, he admitted taking a knife to school on 10 separate occasions. He admitted that, well, as you say, just heard that in 2019 he returned to the Range High School in Formby, his high school at that point. With that knife, he was excluded, but only to return a couple of months later, where he attacked a pupil and broke that pupil's wrist. Police searched his backpack at the time that he was carrying, and inside that backpack was a knife. So, you know, there was incident after incident in which this young man either was directly involved in violence, was telling people of his desire to carry out violence, and violence in the most horrific way, spoke of his desire to carry out a school massacre. Yet each of the agencies he was referred to felt that perhaps it was another agency that should take on responsibility for this, such as Prevent, the counter-extremism programme. It seemed did not want to get involved in Axel Rudikabana because they couldn't pinpoint any particular ideology, any terrorist ideology. He seemed to have a jumble of different ideologies that he was scanning, that he was viewing, because he had an absolutely sickening obsession with violence and death, but not necessarily with one particular ideology. But this counter-extremism programme had Axel Rudikabana referred to them not just once, but 3 times between 2019 and 2021. But not just them, the courts, the youth justice system, the police on multiple occasions, the health service, social services, child safeguarding agencies. None of them in any satisfactory manner dealt with this young man and his spiral down towards a very violent conclusion on the 29th of July at the Heart Space Centre in Southport.
It's so much to digest, Mark. It's such a heavy subject, but of course completely right to be reporting on it. This is one of the most heinous crimes that I can remember reporting. How does it compare to your history following cases like this? How does it compare to other sentencings that you have attended?
Well, listen, I've lost count of the absolute horror that I've sat through and listened to over the years, from as far back as the Dunblane massacres, you know, the massacre there at that primary school in which so many very, very young children were killed by a crazed gunman in that Scottish village, and so many terror cases, of course, over the years as well. But this case, you know, it's right up there, and just the horrific nature of what we're hearing. And for the families, if there is any positive out of this whole sorry episode at the moment, that is that they are going to be spared what could have been 8 weeks of the most harrowing of evidence. They've heard it in summary form today. That was so difficult for them. Some of them understandably decided they didn't want to be in court to listen to that evidence and to view the CCTV images that were coming out and being played in court as well of the attack as it was taking place, of the young girls running out, some of them terribly injured. Screaming, understandably, just looking for help. No help there at that time because emergency services hadn't even reached the scene. The attack was still taking place. Absolutely horrific in nature, as these events always are. So for that, I think we're thankful that the families won't have to sit through that and listen to that. Having said that, though, we've got a public inquiry, and all of this will be, to an extent, replayed again during that process, as well as issues around the missed opportunities. And we keep going back to this because it is so utterly unforgivable of these state agencies not to have picked up on the very obvious signs that we just talk about in summary form here. And we know just how clearly violent this young man was at a very early age. Yet people who it is their professional occupation to assess individuals with violent potential and proclivities seem to have either not been as interested or intellectually curious as they should be, or were just asleep on the job, or were just intent on passing the buck to the next agency to leave them to deal with this mess of a human being. The consequence of that, of course, just a few years later, was what played out at this dance class in Southport. Interestingly, the prosecutor now, in summarising some of the background to the case, is talking about that instance just a week before the stabbings in Southport, where Axel Rudikabana had attempted to get in a taxi to go to Range High School in the town of Formby in Merseyside. That was the secondary school that he attended, the secondary school where he brought the knife to, where he attacked a pupil with a hockey stick, where he had so many encounters and clearly troubled history at that school before eventually being excluded from it. It was the end of term at that point, and police believe that his intention on going back there in the taxi may have been very dark intention indeed, perhaps to carry out a school massacre as he'd fantasised about for so long. And the prosecutor said that, you know, he believed it was unlikely a coincidence that Axel Rudikabana had booked a taxi to go back to the Range High School on the final day of term, the week before the attack at Heartspace. So it is the belief of the authorities that he had murder on his mind that day as well, before he was talked out of it by his father. The taxi driver persuaded not to take him on the 15-mile journey to Range High School, and instead he returned to his house, only to then go to Heartspace a week later. This time, of course, he didn't leave anything to chance. He didn't hang around the house to be perhaps intercepted by his father again and deterred from doing that. He left. He walked a distance from his house to get that taxi to the school, so that clearly the family home, or anyone in the family home, would not necessarily have seen him going into that taxi. But still questions to answer, as we spoke about before, for the family. If a father was so clearly very concerned about what he might be about to do a week earlier, were the police informed? If not, if the police were not informed, that's a criminal offence, potentially. So are there any criminal charges facing the family of Axel Rudikabana? We don't know as yet. The police say it's still a live investigation and they're just not prepared to go there.
It may well be, yes. I mean, the parental responsibility there and the potential for there to be some criminal proceedings against them too in the future. We'll find out. But what you say about the litany of failures, it does make you think, how many more, particularly young men, could there be like Axel Rudikabana, who have had previous, who have been aggressive, violent, have been referred to agencies like Prevent, social services, everything else, expelled from school, who have just been sort of left to fester, and one day might commit something like this. I mean, it doesn't bear thinking about. We're just looking at a full screen of a Liverpool Crown Court, a sort of wider shot of the outside. Of course, you've got police and security presence there. You've also got media as well, of course. But you've also got a number of people who appear to be sort of milling around. Are people there to sort of find out what's happening? It's quite crowded outside the court.
Well, it's a combination, of course. The media are here in force. Some members of the public have come along to look, but there's also, you know, protesters and many protesters who are very distrustful of the mainstream media and the way in which this case has been presented ever since the attacks last July. And you know, many of them are very angry, and that's clearly making it quite difficult for colleagues from other channels, I think, to continue with the coverage in the fulsome way that they would perhaps like to do as yet, and I don't want to tempt fate, but we are uninterrupted in our efforts to continue to impart the information that's coming from court. And that is good because we are in now a very important and I have to say a very difficult phase of the sentencing hearing, and that is the victim impact statements. We're beginning to hear now from some of the family members. We're hearing from a family member of one of the girls who was injured. And we can't give you names because there is an anonymity order protecting those young girls, those girls who survived. And that's more absolutely understandable. But one father anonymously said of his child who was there, he is reading now, when asked if she wished she hadn't been there, his daughter said to him, "I'm glad I might have stopped someone else from getting hurt. Our daughter is strong, our daughter is brave, our daughter is everything that Axel Rudakabana is not from the father." I mean, it's just so incredibly powerful when you hear from the families themselves who, up until now, so many of them understandably have not been able to speak, and of course the anonymity order has meant that, you know, the media can't actually speak to them directly, and that's why, of course, victim impact statements are really the first chance that we're given any opportunity to hear about the thoughts, the loss, just the, you know, the way in which their lives were absolutely and utterly ripped apart by the events on the 29th of July 2024, forever changed for those who, of course, lost their loved ones, and even those who suffered horrific injuries, their lives forever changed. And not just them, the other girls that were there. There were 25 children in total attending that dance class, not all of them injured, but all of them very badly traumatised.
So powerful hearing that father of that injured child, hearing what the child was saying about almost being glad to be injured to protect others. Just an unbelievable mindset, and something that I think we can all respect so very much. But also what a contrast. What a contrast in what he said, that his little girl is everything that Axel Rudakabana is not. We've seen the cowardice from Axel Rudakabana today, whining and shouting and screaming, feigning illness, feigning injury, so he didn't have to sit there and hear the impact of what he did. I mean, the contrast between that father of that brave girl and Axel Rudakabana, it cannot be overstated. My goodness me.
You're so right. It's sickening, actually, the display of selfishness, the display of attention-seeking that we've seen from the dock, from this man who, in any way, shape or form, is not willing to address the absolutely horrific nature of what he did on that day, and the harm, the hurt, the trauma he caused, not just to the families, but to the wider community. And the victim impact statements continue. We're now hearing a victim impact statement read out on behalf of Leanne Lucas. Leanne Lucas and John Hayes were the two adults who were inside the Heart Space Centre looking after that dance class, and two adults who tried their level best to intervene and save those girls as they were being stabbed by Axel Rudakabana. Leanne Lucas has just said in her statement, "How can I live knowing
You okay, Mark?
Oh, Mark, I'm so sorry.
So she said, "How can I live knowing I survived when children died, so...
Oh, Mark.
Mark, if you need a moment, do take a moment.
To hear, I'm fine. To hear an adult trying to come to terms with the enormity of what happened on that day, and to be so full of guilt themselves that they survived and young children died. It's awful. You know, we talk about the adults and how, you know, those who were caught up in this and how their life is forever changed. Well, you're hearing from this woman, this adult who was there trying to do her level best to protect these children, and how guilty and how she should feel anything but guilt.
It is heartbreaking. Every single one of these statements that we've been just catching glimpses of gets you. It goes right to the core, because this is about fundamentally humanity. It's about decency.
Just instructing a class. Just instructing a class, summer holidays, something that was supposed to be nice for young children to go to, joyful. I can't imagine what she's been through, how you continue on.
No, the life-changing impact. Well, this is what these impact statements are all about. I mean, we talk, of course, and we should, about the 3 girls that were killed, but my goodness me, we need to also bear in our minds the 10 girls and adults, 8 girls, 2 adults, who were also injured, who will also carry the weight of this with them for the rest of their lives. Perhaps that has been something that has been missing from much of this coverage.
I'm sorry, were you speaking to me?
Sorry, Mark. Yeah, we were just reflecting on.
I do apologise. Yeah.
No, don't worry at all. Don't worry at all. It's very moving and traumatic to relay those details from the victim impact statement there, from the class instructor just doing her job, doing something nice for the community, doing something nice for children. Should have been joyful. It was the summer holidays. This should never have happened. Just especially how you go on from that, Mark.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's incredibly difficult. Of course, children are resilient. Some will respond better than others over the fullness of time. But an adult, you can understand, and that's why it just got me just now, because any adult that feels that maybe they could have done more, when really, in reality, what can you do with this maniac and a knife doing what he did, stabbing in this frenzied manner that he was? She tried her best, and that's all anyone could ask. But you can understand that she feels absolutely bereft and, incredibly sad that she will not, and feels that, she feels that it's difficult for her, to be alive and go on when the young innocents had their whole life ahead of them, and that's been denied in the most brutal way.
The details of this are clearly deeply moving, deeply emotional, but what is so frustrating and stands in such stark contrast is that Axel Rudakabana is currently not in the court. After being brought into the dock twice, he made such a petulant fuss, he made such a scene, such a spectacle, that he had to be removed. That is a damning indictment of the coward that he is. Mark White, thank you so much for being there for us outside Liverpool Crown Court. I know you'll continue to do your tenacious reporting through in Martin Daubney's programme, but for now, thank you so much for the work that you and indeed Sophie Reaper inside the courtroom have been doing.
Yes, thank you, Mark. Very moving. To see Mark choke over those words. Yeah, hard to imagine what the people who survived this incident, how they must feel.
Yeah.
Knowing that 3 innocent girls just lost their lives in this tragic way. We are hearing more information about the various prevent referrals, what exactly they were for. I'm sure Martin will pick up the baton on that one and bring you the sentencing as and when it comes.
Absolutely. Do not move a muscle. This GB News, this afternoon on GB News, is all Southport. We are looking at this case. We're bringing every update we can from inside the courtroom. And of course, we'll bring you that live sentencing. We're expecting the video feed of the judge in the next hour or so. So it is not one to leave. It is not one to miss. Do stay with us here on GB News. But of course, once the sentencing's done, there'll be a reckoning. There'll be much more to discuss. Well, this is Good Afternoon Britain. Please don't move a muscle. Of course, the one and only Martin Daubney is up next.
Heavy showers first thing will be followed by a warm, cosy day. Boxed boilers. Sponsors of weather on GB News.
Storm Eowyn is fast approaching. The Met Office have issued red weather warnings. We don't issue these lightly, and they're in place for Northern Ireland and parts of Scotland for damaging gusts of wind tomorrow. Here comes that storm, as I said, fast approaching. Ahead of it, we've seen this weather front provide some very heavy rain and gusty winds. That's now heading out into the North Sea, staying fairly soggy, though, well into the evening across parts of Scotland. Then drier for a time, but here comes Storm Eowyn, a spell of heavy rain accompanied by gusty winds, snow for a time across Northern Ireland, quite a bit of snow falling over the hills of Scotland during Friday. Temperatures actually probably rising through the night, but the winds will also be intensifying and getting particularly strong on Friday morning. We have a number of weather warnings in place. Those red warnings for Northern Ireland, Central and Southwest Scotland. Gusts of 80, 90, perhaps even more than that in terms of miles an hour. In exposed areas, we could be close to 100 miles an hour. Particularly bad across Northern Ireland in the morning, that morning rush hour, and then the strongest winds transferring to southwest Scotland during the late morning and into the early part of the afternoon. But it's very windy everywhere. Damaging gusts also possible. We have the amber warning over parts of northern England and North Wales, and yellow warnings covering things further south, where it'll be a wet start for East Anglia and the southeast, but a much, much milder start than we've been used to. That rain will tend to pull away through the day. The winds will ease a little over England and Wales, and actually for many here it's a dry and a fine and a sunny day, but those dangerous gusts still continuing, easing maybe in Northern Ireland by lunchtime, but then into the southwestern corner of Scotland, and the very strong winds then transferring to northern Scotland later in the day. With some brightness, we could reach double figures for a time across the south